She found him by the corral, quiet and humble, a drifter with dirt on his hands and shame in his eyes. When he admitted he couldn't write his own name, she smiled and offered to teach him. Night after night, by lantern light, they practiced each letter until his trembling hand found pride again. But what she never knew was that the man she was teaching wasn't just a drifter. He was a hidden scholar and the true lord of the ranch, and soon her kindness would rewrite both their fates. The storm came without mercy. It rolled across the plains like judgment itself, swallowing the dying light in walls of gray and thunder. The wind tore at the schoolhouse shutters, rattling the glass in their frames, pulling at the weathered wood as if trying to pry the building apart board by board. Rain slashed sideways through the air, turning the dirt road into rivers of mud that carved new paths through the valley. Eleanor Marsh stood at the doorway, both hands wrapped around the iron handle, leaning her full weight against the door as the wind screamed past her ears. Her dress clung to her legs, soaked through from the rain that had found every crack and gap in the old building. Her hair had come loose from its pins, dark strands whipping across her face, sticking to her cheeks. She could barely see 10 feet beyond the porch. The world had become nothing but water and wind, and the terrible roar of the storm swallowing everything in its path. Lightning split the sky, turning the valley white for a single frozen heartbeat, and in that flash she saw the shape of something moving through the darkness. A figure, stumbling, falling forward through the mud. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was fear, sharp and immediate, the kind that told her to slam the door shut and bar it from the inside. But the figure fell again, collapsing to hands and knees in the mud just beyond the schoolhouse fence, and something in that collapse, the way the body seemed to give up, to surrender to the rain, made her hesitate. Thunder rolled across the sky like cannon fire. The figure tried to rise, slipped, fell again. Eleanor's hands trembled on the door handle. Every reasonable thought told her to stay inside, to wait for the storm to pass, to let whoever was out there find shelter somewhere else. The valley wasn't kind to strangers, and a woman alone in a schoolhouse had no business inviting trouble through her door. But then lightning flashed again, and she saw him clearly, a man, young, his clothes torn and plastered to his frame, one arm wrapped around his ribs as if holding himself together. He wasn't walking toward the schoolhouse. He was crawling. His face was turned up to the rain, his mouth open, gasping. Eleanor felt her heart twist. She released the door and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit her like a wall, cold and brutal, soaking her to the skin in seconds. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet, but she grabbed the porch rail and pulled herself forward, down the steps, into the mud. Her boots sank deep with every step, the ground trying to hold her in place. "Wait!" she shouted, but the wind tore her voice away. The man didn't hear her. He was trying to stand again, his legs shaking beneath him, his hands clawing at the fence post for support. Something slipped from his grip. A notebook, small and dark, its pages bleeding ink into the rain. He reached for it desperately, his fingers closing around it even as the water ran through the paper, turning the words inside into nothing but smears and shadows. Eleanor reached him just as he collapsed again. "Stop! Stop moving!" she said, her voice louder now, closer. She dropped to her knees beside him in the mud, her hands going to his shoulders. He flinched at her touch, his eyes snapping open, dark eyes, wide with something between fear and confusion. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said quickly, "but you'll die out here if you don't come inside." He stared at her, his chest heaving, rain pouring down his face. For a moment she thought he might pull away, might refuse her help and drag himself back into the storm. But then his body seemed to give out all at once, his weight sagging against her, and she knew she had only seconds before he lost consciousness completely. Eleanor hooked her arm under his and pulled. He was heavier than she expected, his body dead weight against her side, but she dug her heels into the mud and dragged him forward one step at a time. The wind howled around them, the rain blinding, the world reduced to the few feet between them and the schoolhouse door. Her muscles burned, her breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. When they reached the porch, she hauled him up the steps, his boots scraping against the wood, and shoved the door open with her shoulder. They fell through together, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of wet fabric and exhausted limbs. Eleanor kicked the door shut behind them. The sudden absence of wind felt like silence, even though the storm still raged outside, rattling the walls and hammering against the roof. Inside, the air was still and cold, the only light coming from the dying embers in the iron stove at the far end of the room. She lay there for a moment, gasping, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Then she rolled onto her side and looked at the man beside her. He was unconscious now, his head turned to one side, his breathing shallow and uneven. His face was gaunt, shadowed with exhaustion and something deeper, something that looked like he hadn't slept in days, maybe weeks. His clothes were torn at the knees and elbows, stained with mud and something darker that might have been blood. One of his hands was still clutched around the notebook, holding it against his chest like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Eleanor pushed herself up onto her knees, wincing at the ache in her arms and legs. She needed to move him closer to the stove, needed to get him warm before the cold settled into his bones and took him for good. She grabbed him under the arms and dragged him across the floor. The schoolhouse was small, just one room with rough wooden benches, a teacher's desk near the window, and the iron stove that kept the place warm enough to survive the winters. Eleanor had lived here alone for 3 years now, ever since her husband died and left her with nothing but the teaching position and the roof over her head. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She pulled the man as close to the stove as she dared, then stumbled to her feet and moved quickly to the woodpile in the corner. Her hands shook as she fed logs into the stove, coaxing the embers back to life, blowing gently until the flames caught and began to grow. The firelight flickered across the room, casting long shadows against the walls. Eleanor turned back to the man and knelt beside him again. His face was pale in the firelight, his lips tinged faintly blue. She needed to get him out of the wet clothes, needed to wrap him in something dry before the cold took hold, but she hesitated. Her eyes fell to the notebook still clutched in his hand. Slowly, carefully, she pried his fingers open and lifted the notebook free. It was soaked through, the cover warped and swollen with water, but she could see the faint impression of words on the pages inside, handwriting, careful and deliberate, now bleeding into illegible smears. She set it on the floor beside the stove to dry. Then she moved to the storage chest beneath the window and pulled out an old quilt, one of the few things she'd kept from her marriage. She draped it over the man's body, tucking it around his shoulders and legs, and sat back on her heels, watching his chest rise and fall in the firelight. Thunder rolled overhead, softer now, the storm beginning to move east across the valley. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in her wet dress, and stared at the stranger she'd dragged from the rain. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why had he been crawling through the mud, clutching a notebook like his life depended on it? She didn't know. But something about the way he'd held onto that notebook, something about the desperation in his grip, made her think that whatever he was running from, it wasn't just the storm. The fire crackled in the stove, warm and steady now, filling the room with a soft amber glow. Eleanor stood and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out into the darkness. The rain was lighter now, falling in steady sheets instead of violent bursts, and the wind had died down to a low moan that rattled the shutters but no longer threatened to tear them free. The valley stretched out before her, dark and empty, the faint shapes of distant hills barely visible against the sky. She let the curtain fall and turned back to the man by the stove. He hadn't moved. His breathing was still shallow, but it seemed steadier now, less labored. The color was beginning to return to his face, faint but real, and she allowed herself to hope that he might survive the night. Eleanor moved to her own corner of the room and stripped out of her wet dress, hanging it over the back of a chair to dry. She pulled on a dry shift and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, then returned to the stove and sat down on the floor beside the man, her back against the wall. She was exhausted. Every muscle in her body ached. But she didn't trust herself to sleep, not with a stranger unconscious on her floor, not with so many questions still unanswered. So she sat and watched him through the long hours of the night. The storm passed slowly, the thunder fading into the distance, the rain softening to a gentle patter against the roof. The fire burned low, and Eleanor fed it twice more, keeping the warmth alive in the small room. And as the hours stretched on, she found her gaze drifting again and again to the man's hands. They were rough hands, calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who'd worked hard and often. But there was something else, something she noticed only because the firelight caught it just right. Ink stains. Faint but unmistakable, staining the tips of his fingers and the edge of his palm. Not dirt, not mud. Ink. Eleanor frowned, leaning forward slightly, studying his hands more closely. The stains were old, faded, the kind that came from weeks or months of handling pen and paper. The kind that came from writing. Her eyes moved to the notebook drying by the stove, its pages still damp but beginning to curl at the edges. A drifter with ink-stained fingers and a notebook he'd risk his life to protect. It didn't make sense. Eleanor pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and leaned her head back against the wall, her thoughts circling the mystery like a moth around a flame. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The silence that followed felt strange, almost unnatural after the violence of the storm. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. Eleanor closed her eyes, just for a moment, and when she opened them again the room was filled with the pale gray light of early dawn. She sat up quickly, disoriented, her heart pounding. The man was still there, still wrapped in the quilt, but his eyes were open now, dark eyes, watching her with a quiet intensity that made her freeze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he shifted slightly, wincing as he pushed himself up onto one elbow. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse and rough, barely more than a whisper. "Thank you." Eleanor swallowed, her mouth dry. "You're welcome." He looked around the room slowly, taking in the benches, the chalkboard, the small desk by the window. His gaze lingered on the notebook by the stove, and something flickered across his face, relief maybe, or something close to it. "You saved my book," he said quietly. "I didn't know if it mattered," Eleanor said, "but you were holding it like it did." He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the notebook. "It matters." Another silence fell between them, heavier this time. Eleanor shifted her weight, suddenly aware of how strange this was. A strange man in her home, barely conscious, and yet the air between them felt oddly still, almost careful. "What's your name?" she asked finally. The man hesitated, his jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might not answer at all. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his eyes, something that looked like shame, or maybe regret. "I don't know if I remember how to say it," he said softly. Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked down at his hands, at the ink stains on his fingers. "I haven't used it in a long time." She didn't know what to say to that. So she stood and moved to the stove, adding another log to the fire, giving him space to collect himself. When she turned back, he was sitting up fully now, the quilt draped over his shoulders, his back against the wall. He looked tired, bone-tired, the kind of tired that came from running for too long with nowhere left to go. "You can stay here until you're strong enough to leave," Eleanor said quietly. "But I need to know you're not dangerous." He shook his head slowly. "I'm not." She studied his face, searching for signs of deceit. But all she saw was exhaustion and something that looked like quiet honesty. "All right," she said finally, "then rest. We'll talk more when you're ready." He nodded, his eyes already beginning to drift closed again. Eleanor watched him for a moment longer, then moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The storm had left the valley clean and glistening, the mud already beginning to dry in the pale morning light. The sky was clear now, soft and endless, as if the violence of the night before had never happened. But the questions remained. Who was this man? Where had he come from? And why did he carry a notebook like it held his entire life inside? Eleanor didn't know. But when morning came clear and still, she realized he hadn't yet told her his name, only asked for paper and a pen. He didn't leave. 3 days passed, then 4, and the man who wouldn't say his name remained in the schoolhouse, moving quietly through the margins of Eleanor's days, like a shadow that had learned to keep its distance. He slept beside the stove at night, wrapped in the old quilt, and by morning he was always awake before her, sitting with his back against the wall, the notebook open in his lap. He never wrote in it. He only stared at the ruined pages, at the ink that had bled into ghosts of words, as if trying to remember what had been lost. Eleanor watched him from across the room as she prepared for the school day, pinning her hair back, smoothing her skirts, arranging the slates on the benches. She didn't ask questions. Something about the way he held himself, careful, guarded, like a man who'd learned not to trust the sound of his own voice, told her that questions would only drive him further into silence, so she let him be. On the 4th morning, she set a plate of bread and preserves on the floor beside him and returned to her desk without a word. He ate slowly, his movements deliberate, and when he was finished, he stood and carried the plate to the wash basin by the door, rinsing it clean before setting it carefully on the shelf. Eleanor glanced up from her lesson book. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said quietly, but he kept doing it anyway. By the 5th day, the children began arriving for lessons. They came in small clusters, the younger ones chattering and chasing each other through the door, the older ones trailing behind with their arms full of primers and slates. They stopped short when they saw the man sitting in the corner, their voices dropping to whispers, their eyes wide with curiosity and suspicion. Eleanor stood at the front of the room, her hands folded. "This is a guest," she said simply. "He'll be staying for a time while he recovers from illness. You'll treat him with respect, as you would anyone in need." The children stared. One of the older boys, a lanky 14-year-old named Thomas, leaned over to his seatmate and muttered something Eleanor couldn't hear. The other boy snickered. Eleanor's gaze sharpened. "Thomas, do you have something to share with the class?" Thomas straightened quickly, his face flushing. "No, ma'am." "Good. Then open your primer to page 12. The lesson continued, and the children's attention gradually shifted away from the stranger in the corner. But Eleanor could feel the weight of their glances throughout the morning, could sense the questions they were holding back, the stories they would carry home to their parents. The widow teacher and her stray. She could already hear the whispers forming. At midday, the children scattered outside for their lunch break, and the schoolhouse fell into a quiet lull. Eleanor sat at her desk, rubbing her temples, feeling the exhaustion of the morning settle into her bones. She hadn't slept well since the storm. Every night she woke in the darkness, listening to the sound of the man's breathing across the room, wondering if he would still be there in the morning, or if he would slip away like smoke before dawn. She didn't know why the thought of him leaving made her uneasy, but it did. A soft sound pulled her from her thoughts, the scrape of a boot against the floorboards. She looked up and found the man standing a few feet away, his hands hanging at his sides, his expression uncertain. "I should go," he said quietly. "I'm causing you trouble." Eleanor set down her pen. "Are you well enough to travel?" He hesitated. "I don't know. Then you should stay. The children will be fine," Eleanor said firmly. "They're curious, not frightened. And their parents will talk no matter what I do. That's the way of small towns." He looked down at his hands, at the ink stains that still lingered on his fingers despite days of washing. "I don't want to bring shame to you." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. This man who apologized for existing, who moved through the world as if he believed he didn't deserve the space he occupied. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. His jaw tightened. "I made mistakes. We all have, not like mine." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a weight Eleanor couldn't yet name. She wanted to press, to ask what kind of mistakes could drive a man to wander through a storm, with nothing but a ruined notebook. But something in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she stood and moved to the shelf beside her desk, pulling down a fresh slate and a piece of chalk. She held them out to him. "If you're going to stay, you might as well make yourself useful," she said. "Can you read?" He stared at the slate, then at her. "Can you write?" A pause. "I used to." Eleanor nodded. "Then we'll start there." She gestured to one of the empty benches near the window, away from the children's usual seats. He moved slowly, almost reluctantly, and sat down, his hands resting flat on the wooden surface. Eleanor pulled a chair around and sat across from him, setting the slate between them. "Your name," she said. "Can you write that much?" His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the chalk. He held it the way a man holds something fragile, something that might break under too much pressure. The chalk hovered over the slate for a long moment, and Eleanor thought he might refuse, might set it down and walk out the door. But then he pressed the chalk to the surface and began to draw. The letters came slowly, shakily, like a man remembering a language he'd once spoken fluently, but had forgotten through years of disuse. The first letter was strong, confident, an uppercase that spoke of education, of practice, but the rest wavered, uneven and uncertain. When he finished, Eleanor leaned forward to read. J.R., just 2 letters, an initial and a surname reduced to nothing. "J.R.," she repeated softly. "That's what you want me to call you?" He nodded, not meeting her eyes. Eleanor didn't push. "All right. J.R. it is." She took the slate and erased the letters gently, then wrote a new word in careful script, home. Copy this, she said, turning the slate toward him. He picked up the chalk again and began. The children returned from their lunch break in a burst of noise and motion, their voices filling the schoolhouse as they tumbled through the door and found their seats. Eleanor stood and moved to the front of the room, guiding them through their afternoon lessons, arithmetic for the younger ones, history for the older, reading practice for everyone. J.R. remained at his bench by the window, his head bent over the slate, copying the words she'd given him with slow, painstaking precision. No one bothered him. The children's curiosity had burned itself out over the course of the morning, replaced by the familiar rhythms of lessons and recitations. But Eleanor noticed the way some of them glanced at him when they thought she wasn't looking, not with mockery, but with something closer to fascination, a grown man learning his letters like a child. It was strange. And in a place like this where every face was known and every story already told, strangeness carried weight. When the last child finally left and the schoolhouse fell silent again, Eleanor began tidying the benches, gathering abandoned slates and straightening books. J.R. remained at his seat, still writing, his focus absolute. She moved to stand beside him and looked down at the slate. He'd filled it completely, the same word written over and over in rows that grew steadily neater, more controlled, as if his hand was remembering something his mind had tried to forget. Home, 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 home. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. You write like someone who's done it before, she said quietly. He set the chalk down and stared at the slate. I told you. I used to. Why did you stop? Silence. Then so softly she almost didn't hear it because I didn't deserve to anymore. Eleanor frowned. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to. He stood abruptly, brushing chalk dust from his hands, and moved toward the stove. The conversation was over. Eleanor could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way he turned his back to her and stared into the fire as if the flames held answers he couldn't speak aloud. She wanted to press, wanted to ask what he'd done, who he'd been, why he carried guilt like a coat he couldn't take off, but she'd learned long ago that some stories couldn't be forced. They had to be offered freely, or not at all, so she let him be. That night, after the fire had burned low and the schoolhouse had settled into darkness, Eleanor lay awake on her narrow cot in the corner, listening to the sound of J.R.'s breathing across the room. It was steady now, no longer labored the way it had been those first few nights. He was healing, growing stronger. Soon he would be well enough to leave. And then what? Eleanor stared at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of shadow and firelight, and found herself hoping, foolishly, dangerously, that he wouldn't. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Mornings began with lessons, Eleanor at the front of the room, the children at their benches, and J.R. at his place by the window, working through primers meant for 8-year-olds with the focused intensity of a scholar. He never spoke during class, never drew attention to himself, but Eleanor noticed the way his hand moved across the slate, the way the letters grew more confident with each passing day. He wasn't learning, he was remembering. In the afternoons, when the children scattered home and the schoolhouse emptied, J.R. would step outside and find work to do. He repaired the broken fence line behind the building, replacing rotted posts and restringing wire with a precision that spoke of experience. He patched holes in the roof where the rain had leaked through, climbed up with shingles salvaged from the shed and hammered them into place while Eleanor watched from below, holding the ladder steady. He never asked permission. He simply saw what needed fixing and fixed it. And every evening, when the work was done and the sun hung low over the valley, they would sit together at the long table in the schoolhouse, Eleanor on one side, J.R. on the other, and she would teach him. Not like a teacher instructing a student, like two people sharing something fragile and necessary. She would write a sentence on the slate, the rain fell softly through the night, and he would copy it, his hands steady, his penmanship improving with every word. Sometimes she would read aloud from the books on her shelf, stories of faraway places, poems about loss and longing, passages from histories she'd taught so many times she knew them by heart. J.R. would listen in silence, his eyes fixed on the pages, as if he could see the words forming in the air between them. Once, she read a passage about a man who'd left his home and wandered for years before finding his way back. When she finished, she looked up and found J.R. staring at the window, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "Are you all right?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if you can't go back? What if the place you left doesn't want you anymore? Eleanor closed the book slowly. Then you find a new place, and if you don't deserve one? She studied his face, the lines of exhaustion and regret etched into his features. Everyone deserves a place. JR, even people who've made mistakes. He looked at her then, really looked at her. And for a moment she saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes. Something that looked like hope struggling against a lifetime of shame. Then he looked away. I don't know if I believe that, he said quietly. Eleanor didn't answer. She simply reached across the table and placed her hand over his, just for a moment, a silent gesture that said more than words ever could. He didn't pull away. Outside, the prairie stretched dark and endless beneath a sky full of stars, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its voice lonely and defiant against the silence. The weeks passed. The children grew accustomed to JR's presence, and eventually they stopped whispering about him altogether. He became part of the landscape, as familiar as the chalkboard or the iron stove. Some of the younger ones even began greeting him shyly when they arrived in the mornings, and he would nod back, the ghost of a smile flickering across his face. Eleanor noticed other things too. The way he moved through the schoolhouse with a quiet grace, never taking up more space than necessary. The way he listened when she spoke, his attention absolute, as if every word she said mattered. The way he looked at the children during lessons, his expression thoughtful, almost wistful, as if he were remembering something he'd lost long ago. And late at night, when he thought she was asleep, she would hear him turning the pages of his notebook, running his fingers over the ruined words, as if trying to will them back into existence. One evening, as the lamplight flickered low and the air grew cool, Eleanor found herself watching him across the table. He was copying a passage she'd assigned him, his hand moving with confidence now, the letters clean and precise, too precise. She frowned, leaning forward. JR. He looked up. You're not just remembering how to write, she said slowly. You already know how, don't you? His hand stilled on the slate. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he set the chalk down and met her gaze, and there was something in his eyes, something resigned and weary, as if he'd been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. Yes, he said quietly. Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. Then why? Because I wanted to feel like I was learning something good again, he said, his voice rough. Something that didn't come with a price. Something that was just simple. She stared at him, her mind racing. Who are you? He looked down at his hands, at the ink stains that had never fully faded. Someone who doesn't deserve your kindness. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her thoughts spinning. A man who wrote with the skill of someone educated. A man who carried himself with quiet dignity despite his torn clothes and worn boots. A man who spoke like someone who'd once held authority but had lost it, or walked away from it. You're not a drifter, she said softly. Are you? He shook his head slowly. No. Then what are you? He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again they were filled with a sadness so deep it made Eleanor's chest ache. I'm someone who made a choice I can't take back, he said quietly, and I've been running from it ever since. Before Eleanor could respond, before she could ask what choice, what mistake could have driven him so far from whoever he'd once been, a sound cut through the silence. A knock, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the schoolhouse like a gunshot. They both froze. Eleanor's gaze darted to the door, her heart suddenly pounding. No one came to the schoolhouse after dark. No one had reason to. The knock came again, louder this time. JR stood slowly, his face draining of color. Don't answer it. I have to, Eleanor whispered. If I don't, they'll know something's wrong. She moved to the door, her hands trembling, and pulled it open. The sheriff stood on the porch, his hat pulled low, his expression unreadable in the lamplight spilling from inside. Behind him, two other men waited in the shadows, their faces hard and watchful. Evening, Mrs. Marsh, the sheriff said, his voice polite but edged with something that made Eleanor's skin prickle. Sorry to disturb you so late. Eleanor forced herself to breathe evenly. What can I do for you, Sheriff? His gaze moved past her into the schoolhouse, landing on JR standing beside the table. I need to know, the sheriff said slowly, who that man is. The silence stretched thin and dangerous. Eleanor's mind raced, searching for words, for explanations, for anything that might protect the man who'd spent weeks learning to write his name again in her schoolhouse. But before she could speak, J.R. stepped forward into the light, his shoulders squared, his voice steady. "My name," he said quietly, "is Jonathan Ransom." The sheriff's expression didn't change. But something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or satisfaction. "I thought so," he said. Eleanor's breath caught. Ransom. The name echoed in her mind, pulling at memories, at stories she'd heard whispered in town, stories of the old ranch family that had once owned half the valley, stories of scandal and disgrace and a son who'd vanished years ago. She turned to look at J.R., at Jonathan, and saw the truth written in his face. He wasn't a drifter. He was the prodigal heir, and the valley had just remembered his name. But one night, when he copied her name into his notebook, a knock came from the darkness, the sheriff, asking who the stranger was. The sheriff didn't take him. Eleanor would remember that detail later, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. The sheriff had stood on her porch with 2 men at his back, had spoken Jonathan Ransom's name aloud like an accusation, and then nothing, no handcuffs, no orders. Just a long, measuring silence that stretched between the 3 men like a rope pulled taut. "You planning on staying here?" the sheriff asked finally, his eyes never leaving Jonathan's face. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "For now. People are going to talk. Let them." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Eleanor, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Mrs. Marsh, you understand what you're doing." Eleanor lifted her chin, her hands clenched at her sides to keep them from trembling. "I'm offering shelter to someone in need. That's all. That's all," the sheriff repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. He looked back at Jonathan. "Your family's been looking for you. I know. They want you back at the ranch. I'm sure they do. You can't hide here, forever." Jonathan's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "I'm not hiding. I just needed time." The sheriff studied him for another long moment, then nodded once, sharp and final. "Time's running out, son. Sooner or later, you're going to have to face what you left behind." He turned and stepped off the porch, his boots heavy against the wood. The 2 men followed without a word, melting back into the darkness like shadows returning to their source. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching until the sound of their horses faded into the distance. Then she closed the door and turned to find Jonathan still standing by the table, his hands braced against the wood, his head bowed. "Jonathan Ransom," she said softly. He flinched at the sound of his full name, as if hearing it aloud was a physical blow. Eleanor moved slowly across the room, her heart still racing, her thoughts a tangled mess of questions and realizations. "That's who you are. The Ransom family, they own half the valley. They used to," Jonathan said quietly, "before I ruined it." "What did you do?" He shook his head, his shoulders tense. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." He looked up then, and the expression on his face stopped her cold. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was shame, deep and corrosive, the kind that had been eating at him for so long it had become part of who he was. "I made a choice," he said hoarsely. "A choice that cost people everything. And when I realized what I'd done, I couldn't stay. I couldn't face them. So I left." Eleanor took a step closer. How long ago? 3 years. 3 years. The same amount of time she'd been alone in the schoolhouse, teaching other people's children, living in the margins of a town that tolerated her, but never truly accepted her. 3 years of running, of hiding, of trying to become someone else. She understood that better than he knew. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said quietly. "But you need to know. Whatever you did, whatever you're running from, it doesn't change what I've seen these past weeks." Jonathan's throat worked. "And what have you seen? A man who fixes things, who listens, who works harder than anyone I've ever known, even when no one's watching." She paused. "A man who's trying." His eyes closed, and for a moment she thought he might break, might finally let the weight he carried collapse around him. But then he drew in a shaky breath and straightened, pulling the armor back into place. "I should go," he said. "Before this gets worse for you." "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and Jonathan stared at her in surprise. "You're not well enough yet," Eleanor continued, forcing her voice to steady. "And I meant what I told the sheriff. You're welcome here as long as you need to stay. Eleanor, I don't care what the town says. I stopped caring about that a long time ago." It was true. She'd learned, in the years since her husband's death, that people would talk no matter what she did. They'd talked when she'd stayed in the schoolhouse alone. They'd talked when she'd turned down offers of marriage from men who wanted a housekeeper more than a wife. They'd talk now about the widow and the disgraced heir, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But she could choose not to let their words control her. Jonathan was watching her with something that looked like wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor met his gaze. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, even you." The silence that followed was different from before. Softer, warmer, filled with something neither of them could name, but both could feel settling into the space between them. Finally, Jonathan nodded. "Thank you." Eleanor turned away, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how intimate this moment felt in the lamplight. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be hard enough." She was right. By mid-morning, the entire town knew. Eleanor could feel it in the way parents lingered when they dropped their children at the schoolhouse, their eyes sharp and assessing as they glanced through the windows. She could hear it in the whispers that followed her when she walked to the general store for supplies, the way conversations died when she approached and picked up again the moment she passed. The widow and the ransom boy, the teacher and the heir. What was she thinking, taking him in like that? Didn't she know what he'd done? Eleanor held her head high and ignored them all. But Jonathan felt the weight of their judgment differently. She could see it in the way he moved through the schoolhouse now, quieter, more careful, as if trying to make himself invisible. He no longer sat by the window during lessons. Instead, he stayed in the back corner, out of sight, his presence reduced to a shadow the children barely noticed. In the afternoons, when the schoolhouse emptied, he worked outside, always outside now, away from prying eyes. He repaired the broken fence line that ran along the eastern edge of the property, replacing rotted posts one by one, his movements methodical and precise. Eleanor would watch him from the window, a cup of tea warming her hands, and wonder what he was thinking as he worked. Was he remembering the ranch he'd left behind, the family that wanted him back, the life he'd walked away from? Or was he like her, simply trying to find peace in the repetition of simple tasks? She didn't ask. But one afternoon, when the work was done and the sun hung low and golden over the valley, Eleanor stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee and found Jonathan sitting on the fence rail, staring out at the horizon. "Thought you might want this," she said, offering him one of the mugs. He took it with a nod of thanks, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic. Eleanor climbed up to sit beside him, her skirts bunching awkwardly around her knees, and for a while they just sat there in silence, watching the light turn the prairie grass to burnished gold. "It's beautiful here," Jonathan said finally. Eleanor glanced at him. "You sound surprised." "I am. I spent so long trying to leave I forgot what I was leaving behind." "Do you regret it? Leaving?" Jonathan was quiet for a long time. "I regret what caused it. But no, I don't regret leaving. I couldn't have stayed, not after what I'd done." Eleanor took a sip of her coffee, the bitter warmth spreading through her chest. "The sheriff said your family wants you back." "They want the heir back," Jonathan corrected quietly. "That's not the same thing. What's the difference?" He looked at her then, and there was a sadness in his eyes that made her chest ache. "The heir is a role, a responsibility, a name on a deed. It's not a person. It's just what they need me to be." Eleanor understood that feeling more than she could say. She'd spent years being the widow, the teacher, the woman people tolerated but never quite welcomed. She knew what it was like to be reduced to a role, to have people see the function you served instead of the person you were. "What do you want to be?" she asked softly. Jonathan's throat worked, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know anymore. I spent so long pretending to be someone else I'm not sure I remember who I was before." Eleanor set her mug down on the fence post and turned to face him fully. "Then maybe it's time to figure it out, not who you were, who you want to be now." Jonathan met her gaze, and for a moment something passed between them. Something fragile and tentative, like the first green shoots pushing through frozen ground. "I think," he said slowly, "I'd like to be someone who deserves your kindness." Eleanor's breath caught. "You already are." The words hung in the air between them, and for a heartbeat she thought he might reach for her, might close the small distance that separated them on the fence rail. But then he looked away, his jaw tight, and the moment passed. "The town's going to get worse," he said quietly. "The talk, the judgment. Are you sure you want to deal with that?" Eleanor picked up her mug again, cradling it in her hands. "I've been dealing with it for 3 years." I can handle a few more weeks. It might be more than a few weeks. Then it's more than a few weeks. Jonathan shook his head slowly, something like disbelief flickering across his face. I don't understand you. What's to understand? You barely know me. You don't owe me anything. And yet you're willing to risk your reputation, your livelihood, everything. For what? A stranger who showed up in the rain? Eleanor turned to look at him fully, her expression serious. You're not a stranger anymore, Jonathan, and maybe I'm not doing this just for you. Maybe I'm doing it because for the first time in 3 years I don't feel so alone. The confession slipped out before she could stop it, raw and honest, and she immediately wished she could take it back. But Jonathan's expression softened, and when he spoke his voice was gentle. I don't feel alone either. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and they sat together in the golden light. Two people who'd been running from different things but had somehow found each other in the quiet space between one life and the next. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Mornings were for teaching. Eleanor stood at the front of the classroom, guiding the children through their lessons, while Jonathan worked in the back, helping the younger ones with their letters when they struggled. He never overstepped, never drew attention to himself, but the children began gravitating toward him anyway, the quiet man who knew how to explain things simply, who never lost patience when they made mistakes. Eleanor would catch herself watching him sometimes, seeing the way his face softened when a child finally understood a difficult concept, the way he smiled, really smiled, when one of the little ones wrote their name correctly for the first time. This was who he'd been before, she realized, not the heir, not the man burdened by expectations and mistakes, just someone who cared, who wanted to help, who found joy in small victories. Afternoons were for work. Jonathan had moved beyond the fence line now, tackling larger projects, rebuilding the sagging porch steps, replacing broken window panes, patching the roof more thoroughly. Eleanor would bring him water or coffee, and they would talk while he worked, conversations that meandered through safe topics like the weather and the children's progress and the books on her shelf. But sometimes in the pauses between words, she would catch him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something warm and careful and achingly tender. And sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, she would let herself look back. Evenings were the best part. After the last child left and the schoolhouse fell into its familiar quiet, Eleanor and Jonathan would sit at the long table, the lamp burning low between them, and continue the lessons that had started weeks ago. But they weren't teacher and student anymore. They were something else. Two people sharing stories, trading ideas, finding comfort in each other's presence. One night Eleanor brought out a book of poetry she'd kept hidden in her desk drawer, poems her husband had given her on their wedding day. She hadn't been able to look at it in years, but somehow, with Jonathan sitting across from her, it felt safe to open it again. She read aloud, her voice soft in the lamplight, and when she finished, Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. That's beautiful, he said finally. Eleanor closed the book carefully. My husband gave this to me. I haven't read it since he died. Why tonight? She didn't know how to answer that. How could she explain that something about Jonathan's presence made the past feel less heavy? That for the first time in years she could look at reminders of what she'd lost without feeling like they would drown her? Because I wanted to, she said simply. Jonathan nodded slowly, understanding something she hadn't said aloud. Then he reached across the table and touched the book gently, his fingers tracing the worn spine. He must have loved you very much. Eleanor's throat tightened. He did. Do you still love him? The question should have felt invasive, too personal, but coming from Jonathan it just felt honest. I'll always love him, Eleanor said quietly. But I'm learning that loving someone who's gone doesn't mean you can't move forward. Jonathan's hand stilled on the book. How do you do that? Move forward? Eleanor looked at him, at the man who'd spent 3 years running from his past, and felt her heart ache for him. You start by forgiving yourself. His eyes closed. I don't know if I can. Then start smaller. Forgive yourself for today, for right now, and tomorrow do it again. When he opened his eyes, they were bright with unshed tears. Is that what you do? Every day, Eleanor whispered. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows across the table, and in that moment the distance between them felt both infinite and impossibly small. Jonathan pulled his hand back slowly. I should let you sleep, but neither of them moved. They sat there in the lamplight, the poetry book resting on the table between them, and outside the prairie wind whispered through the grass carrying the scent of wildflowers and rain and the promise of something neither of them dared name. It was during one of these quiet evenings, nearly a month after the sheriff's visit, that Eleanor made a discovery that changed everything. Jonathan had been working on a passage she'd assigned him, copying lines from a history text when he set down his pen and stretched his hand, wincing slightly. Eleanor had noticed the way he favored his right hand sometimes, the way he would flex his fingers as if working out old stiffness. "Does it hurt?" she asked. He glanced at her, surprised. "Sometimes. Old injury." "From what?" "Too much writing," he said with a faint smile. "Years of it." Eleanor frowned. "What kind of writing?" Jonathan hesitated, and she could see him weighing how much to reveal. Then he sighed, the resistance draining out of him. "Correspondence, contracts, legal documents. Everything the ranch required." He looked down at his hand. "My father believed the heir should understand every aspect of the business. So I learned. Letters to buyers, agreements with railroad companies, deeds and transfers, and endless accounting. By the time I was 20, I could draft a contract faster than any lawyer in the territory." Eleanor stared at him. "You weren't just educated. You were trained. For a life I didn't want," Jonathan said quietly. "Every word I wrote was another brick in a wall I was building around myself. And when I finally realized what I'd become, what I'd helped create, it was too late to tear it down without destroying everything. So you left, so I ran." He looked at her, his eyes dark, like a coward. Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand, the one that ached from years of writing words that had trapped him. "You're not a coward. You're here. You're trying. That takes more courage than staying ever would have." Jonathan's fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment they sat like that, hands clasped across the table, the lamp burning low between them. Then Eleanor stood, still holding his hand, and moved around the table to stand beside him. She didn't plan what happened next. She simply followed the instinct that had been building between them for weeks, the pull that made her feel less alone, that made the world feel warmer. She touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Jonathan went very still, his breath catching. "Eleanor." "I know," she whispered. "I know this is complicated. I know people will talk. I know you're still figuring out who you are, but I don't care. Not anymore." His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it against his cheek. I can't promise. I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking for this. Right now, and before either of them could think better of it, before the weight of the world could come crashing back in, Eleanor leaned down and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, a question more than a declaration. But then Jonathan's hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like relief and longing and homecoming all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. "Stay," she whispered. Jonathan's arms came around her, pulling her close. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the night was clear and still, the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The prairie stretched endless in all directions, and somewhere in the darkness a night bird sang, its voice pure and haunting in the silence. Inside the schoolhouse, two people who'd been broken by different kinds of loss held each other in the lamplight, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, they felt whole. But just as warmth found its way into her heart again, a letter arrived, sealed with the crest of the family that once owned half the valley. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a boy Eleanor didn't recognize, too well dressed for the town's children, his boots polished, his shirt pressed crisp beneath a wool coat that spoke of money and careful upbringing. He couldn't have been more than 10, but he stood on the schoolhouse porch with the rigid posture of someone who'd been given explicit instructions and intended to follow them precisely. Eleanor opened the door to find him holding an envelope, thick cream paper sealed with dark red wax. Even before she saw the imprint in the wax, the stylized R surrounded by wheat stalks, she knew. "Mrs. Marsh?" the boy asked, his voice formal. "Yes, I was told to deliver this to you directly, and to wait for a response." Eleanor took the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. The weight of it felt significant, heavy with more than just paper. "Who sent you?" "The Ransom estate, ma'am." Behind her she heard Jonathan's footsteps stop. He'd been setting up the classroom for the day, arranging slates on the benches. but now the schoolhouse had gone completely silent. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder and saw him standing frozen halfway across the room, his face drained of color, his eyes fixed on the envelope in her hands. "Tell them," Eleanor said slowly, turning back to the boy, "that I'll respond when I'm ready." The boy's expression flickered with uncertainty. "Ma'am, I was instructed to wait." "Then you'll wait outside." She closed the door firmly and stood there for a moment, the envelope burning in her hands like a hot coal. Through the window she could see the boy retreat to the edge of the porch, his shoulders hunched against the morning cold, his breath forming small clouds in the air. Eleanor turned to find Jonathan had moved closer, his eyes locked on the letter. "It's from them," he said quietly. "Not a question." "Yes. What do they want?" Eleanor broke the seal, the wax cracking cleanly, and unfolded the single sheet inside. The handwriting was precise, elegant. The letters formed with the kind of careful control that came from expensive education and years of practice. She read it silently first, her heart sinking with every line. Then she looked up at Jonathan. "They want you to come home. They're offering." She glanced back at the letter. "They're offering to forgive everything, whatever happened. They say the ranch needs you, that the family needs you, and that it's time to set aside past grievances for the good of everyone involved." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "What else?" Eleanor hesitated. "They mention me." His eyes darkened. "How?" "They say they understand you've been receiving charity from a kind widow, and they're grateful for my Christian compassion, but that it's inappropriate for you to continue imposing on my generosity." Eleanor's voice hardened as she read the next part. "They've arranged for a carriage to collect you this afternoon. They expect you to be ready." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Jonathan moved to the window and stared out at the boy waiting on the porch, his hands clenched at his sides. "They expect. They always expect. You don't have to go." He let out a bitter laugh. "Don't I? Jonathan, you don't understand what they're like, Eleanor. This letter isn't a request. It's a command wrapped in polite language, and if I don't comply, they'll find other ways to make their point." He turned to face her, and the expression on his face was something between resignation and rage. "They'll go after you. Your position here, your reputation, whatever it takes to force my hand." Eleanor lifted her chin. "Let them try. Eleanor, you can't." "I can, and I will. I'm not afraid of them. You should be." Jonathan crossed the room quickly, taking her hands in his. "These aren't people who make idle threats. My father built this empire by crushing anyone who stood in his way. My mother learned to smile while holding a knife behind her back. And my brother—" He stopped, his throat working. "My brother would burn this schoolhouse to the ground if he thought it would bring me back." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "Your brother, Marcus, he's the one who really runs things now. Our father's too old, too sick. Marcus is the one who wants me back, not because he loves me, but because without an heir everything falls to him. And he doesn't want that responsibility. He wants to keep playing the second son, spending money and taking risks without consequences. So he needs you to be the heir." "Exactly." Jonathan released her hands and stepped back. "And he'll do whatever it takes to make that happen." Eleanor looked down at the letter, at the elegant handwriting that hid so much cruelty beneath its polished surface. "What did you do, Jonathan? What happened 3 years ago?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he moved to one of the benches and sat down heavily, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "There was a family," he said quietly, "the Burkes. They had a farm on the eastern edge of the valley. Good land, water access, perfect for expansion. My father wanted it. He wanted to connect our holdings, create one continuous stretch of property from the mountains to the rail line." Eleanor sat down across from him, her heart already aching for what was coming. The Burkes wouldn't sell. They'd been there for 2 generations. It was their home. So my father had me draw up a contract, a loan agreement with terms that looked generous on the surface but were designed to fail. I was good at that, making things look fair while hiding the trap underneath. His voice was hollow. The Burkes signed. They trusted me. I looked them in the eye and told them it was a good deal. And they believed me. What happened? Exactly what my father planned. When they couldn't meet the payments structured to be impossible, we foreclosed, took everything. The farm, the house, the livestock, everything. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists on his knees. Burke tried to fight it, hired a lawyer, took us to court. But the contract was airtight. I'd made sure of that. The judge ruled in our favor, and 2 weeks later the family packed what they could carry and left the valley. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Where did they go? I don't know. I heard they tried to start over in Colorado, but the winter that year was brutal. The children, his voice cracked. There were 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, younger than most of your students. I don't know if they made it. The weight of that confession settled over the schoolhouse like a shroud. Eleanor understood now, understood the shame that had driven him into the storm, the guilt that made him believe he didn't deserve kindness, the reason he'd tried to erase his own name. You were young, she said softly. I was 22, old enough to know better. You were doing what your father told you to do. That's not an excuse. Jonathan looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed. I knew it was wrong. I knew that contract would destroy them. But I did it anyway because it was easier than standing up to my father. Because I was afraid of disappointing him, of losing his approval. So I chose him over them, over people who'd done nothing but try to build a life. Eleanor reached across the space between them and took his hand. What happened after? I stayed for 6 more months, tried to pretend everything was fine, but I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I looked at that land that should have been theirs, I felt like I was suffocating. Finally, one night, I just left, took nothing but my notebook and the clothes on my back and walked away. I've been running ever since. Your notebook, Eleanor said slowly, understanding dawning. The one you had in the storm. Jonathan nodded. I'd written it all down. Every contract I'd drafted, every family we'd pushed out, every piece of land we'd taken. I thought if I documented it, if I wrote down what I'd done, maybe somehow I could make it right. But I couldn't. All I could do was carry the evidence of my crimes and keep moving. Eleanor squeezed his hand. You're not that person anymore, aren't I? The moment I go back to that ranch, the moment I step into that house, I'll become him again. The heir. The man who does what he's told and destroys lives to make his father proud. Then don't go. It's not that simple. The door burst open, cutting him off. The boy from earlier stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his eyes wide. Behind him, Eleanor could see movement. Horses, carriages, people gathering in the road beyond the schoolhouse fence. Ma'am, the boy said urgently, Mr. Marcus Ransom is here. He says if his brother won't come willingly, he'll come in and get him. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Jonathan stood slowly, his face hardening into an expression she'd never seen before. Cold, controlled, every emotion locked down behind walls that had taken years to build. Tell him I'll be out in a moment, he said, his voice flat. The boy nodded and disappeared. Jonathan turned to Eleanor, and for a heartbeat she saw past the walls to the fear underneath. I'm sorry. I should have left before. It came to this. Don't you dare apologize. Eleanor stood and moved to him, gripping his arms. You listen to me, Jonathan Ransom. Whatever happens out there, whatever they say or do, you remember who you are now, not who you were 3 years ago, who you've become. And who is that? A man who helps children learn to read, who fixes broken things without being asked, who spent a month sitting at a table with me, learning to write his name again because he wanted to remember what it felt like to create something good. Her voice broke. You're a good man, Jonathan. Don't let them take that from you. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her tightly, and for a moment they just stood there, holding each other as if they could stop time through sheer force of will. Then he stepped back, his expression settling into something resolute. Stay inside, he said quietly. Please. Before she could protest, he walked to the door and stepped out into the cold morning light. Eleanor moved to the window, her heart pounding, and watched as Jonathan descended the porch steps and moved toward the group of men waiting by the road. At the center of the group was a man who could only be Marcus Ransom. He sat astride a black horse, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, taking in every detail of the scene before him. He was older than Jonathan, perhaps 35, with the same dark hair but a harder face, lines etched around his mouth that spoke of cruelty more than laughter. He wore expensive clothes, tailored perfectly, and carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no. Behind him were 5 other men, all armed, all watching Jonathan with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. And beyond them, already gathering at the edges of the road, were townspeople. Eleanor could see familiar faces, parents of her students, shopkeepers, farmers, drawn by the spectacle of the Ransom heir finally confronted by his family. Jonathan stopped a few feet from Marcus's horse and looked up at his brother. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Marcus smiled, a cold, calculated expression that made Eleanor's skin crawl even from a distance. "Hello, little brother," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "Did you miss us?" Jonathan's hands were steady at his sides, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "Marcus, that's all you have to say? 3 years of silence, and all I get is my name?" Marcus's smile widened. "I expected more. Gratitude, perhaps, for coming all this way to bring you home. I didn't ask you to come. No, but you knew we would. Eventually." Marcus's gaze drifted past Jonathan to the schoolhouse, to where Eleanor stood watching from the window. "Tell me, little brother, was she worth it? The widow teacher? Is that why you've been hiding here, playing house with a woman desperate enough to take in strays?" Eleanor's hands clenched against the windowsill. Jonathan's voice went deadly quiet. "Leave her out of this. Why? She's part of it now. The whole valley's talking about it, the disgraced heir and the lonely widow playing at redemption in a schoolhouse." Marcus leaned forward in his saddle. "Do you really think you can start over here? That you can erase what you did by teaching a few children their letters? I'm not trying to erase anything." "No? Then what are you trying to do?" Jonathan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, carrying to the crowd that had gathered to watch. "I'm trying to be better than I was." Marcus's smile faded. "Better, that's an interesting word coming from you. Better than the man who destroyed the Burke family? Better than the coward who ran away when things got difficult?" "Yes," Jonathan said simply. The crowd murmured, a ripple of reaction spreading through the gathered townspeople. Eleanor could see some faces hardening, others softening, as they listened to this confrontation playing out before them. Marcus straightened in his saddle, and his voice took on an edge like broken glass. "You don't get to be better, Jonathan. You don't get to walk away from your responsibilities, hide for 3 years, and then decide you've earned redemption because you spent a few weeks doing manual labor. The ranch needs you. The family needs you. And whether you like it or not, you're coming home. No." The word hung in the air like a thrown knife. Marcus's expression darkened. "What did you say?" "I said no. I'm not going back. Not now. Not ever." The crowd's murmuring grew louder, more agitated. Eleanor could see shock and approval warring on different faces, could feel the tension ratcheting higher with every passing second. Marcus dismounted slowly, deliberately, and walked toward his brother until they stood face to face. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that Eleanor had to strain to hear it. "You're making a mistake. It's my mistake to make. You think this town will protect you? These people?" Marcus gestured to the crowd. "They tolerate the widow because she's useful. But you? You're the son of the man who's taken land from half their neighbors. You're the heir to everything they resent. And when the choice comes between sheltering you or protecting themselves, what do you think they'll do?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "I'll take my chances." Marcus stared at him for another long moment, and then something in his expression changed, shifted, from anger to something colder, more calculated. "Very well," he said, stepping back. "If that's your choice, so be it. But understand this, little brother. Every day you stay here, every day you continue this pathetic attempt at redemption, makes it harder for everyone around you. The school teacher, the children she teaches, their families, everyone." He turned to address the crowd, his voice rising, carrying to every person gathered on the road. "My brother stole from you," Marcus called out. "He stole land, livelihoods, futures. He drafted the contracts that took the Burke farm, the Morrison homestead, the Chen family's water rights. He did it with a smile, with promises that everything was fair and legal. And when those families lost everything, he slept soundly in his bed." Eleanor felt her stomach drop as she saw heads nodding in the crowd, saw old anger resurface on familiar faces. Marcus continued, relentless. "Now he wants you to forget. He wants you to see him as changed, as redeemed, because he spent a few weeks pretending to be something he's not. But ask yourselves, can a man like that truly change? Or is he just hiding here, waiting for his moment to slip back into the life of comfort and power he left behind?" "That's not true." Eleanor found herself shouting from the window before she could stop herself. Every head turned toward her. Marcus's smile returned. "Ah, the widow speaks. Tell me, Mrs. Marsh, how well do you really know my brother? Has he told you about the contracts, the families he destroyed, the children who suffered because of his ambition? Eleanor's voice was steady despite her racing heart. He told me everything. He's carried that guilt every day for 3 years. That's more than most men would do. Guilt isn't redemption, Marcus shot back. Guilt is just fear dressed up in noble clothes. Then what would you have him do? Eleanor demanded. What would redemption look like to you? Marcus's eyes glittered. There is no redemption for some sins, Mrs. Marsh. There's only payment, and my brother's debt is long overdue. He turned back to Jonathan. Last chance. Come home willingly, take up your responsibilities, and maybe, we can find a way to make this right. Stay here, and I promise you, everyone you care about will suffer for it. The threat hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Jonathan's face was pale, but his voice was rock steady. Do what you have to do, Marcus, but I'm not leaving. Marcus stared at his brother for a long, dangerous moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already known. So be it. He turned and remounted his horse in one smooth motion. The 5 armed men followed suit, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. People of this town, Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. I came here today offering my brother a chance to do the right thing. He's refused. So I'll offer you the same choice. Anyone who shelters him, who employs him, who offers him comfort or aid, you'll be choosing a side. And I promise you, it's the wrong side. He pulled his horse around and rode off down the road, his men falling in behind him. The sound of hoofbeats faded slowly into the distance. But the crowd didn't disperse. They remained, dozens of townspeople standing in the cold morning air, staring at Jonathan with expressions that ranged from sympathy to fury to fear. One man stepped forward, Thomas Garrett, father of one of Eleanor's students. He was a farmer, his hands rough with work, his face weathered by sun and wind. Is it true? He asked, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. What he said about the contracts? Jonathan turned to face him, and Eleanor saw him make a choice, to stand in truth or hide behind excuses. Yes, Jonathan said clearly. It's true. I drafted contracts designed to fail. I helped my father take land from families who couldn't fight back. The Burkes, the Morrisons, the Chens, all of them. I knew what I was doing, and I did it anyway. A woman's voice rose from the crowd. The Burkes had children, 3 little ones. I know, Jonathan said, his voice breaking slightly. I know. My cousin lost his homestead because of a contract like that, another man called out. Had to move to Colorado. He died there. Fever took him in the winter. I'm sorry, Jonathan said. I know that's not enough. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying. Trying? Thomas's voice was hard. Trying to what? Make yourself feel better? Earn forgiveness you don't deserve? No. Trying to be better than I was. Trying to help instead of hurt. I know it doesn't balance the scales, but it's all I can do. The crowd was silent, tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Then a new voice spoke up, quiet but clear. He fixed my fence. Everyone turned to see Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman whose family had lost their water rights years ago. She stood at the edge of the crowd, leaning on a cane, her face lined with age and hardship. 2 weeks ago, she continued, my fence broke. The posts rotted through and the wire came down. I couldn't afford to fix it myself. My animals were getting out. She looked at Jonathan. You came by one morning and fixed it. Didn't ask for payment. Didn't even tell me your name. Just fixed it and left. Jonathan stared at her, surprise flickering across his face. Another voice spoke up. Mr. Morrison, the man whose homestead had been taken. You brought firewood to my mother last month. She's too old to chop it herself, and I was laid up with a broken leg. You left it stacked on her porch. More voices joined in, one by one. You helped my son with his reading when he was falling behind. You pulled my wagon out of the mud on the East Road. You gave my daughter your coat when she was walking home in the rain. Eleanor's throat tightened as she listened, realizing what Jonathan had been doing during all those afternoons when he disappeared into town. Not hiding, helping, making quiet amends wherever he could, never asking for recognition, never seeking forgiveness. Thomas Garrett's expression had softened, but his voice was still cautious. Those are good things, but they don't erase the past. No, Jonathan agreed quietly. They don't, and I'm not asking them to. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to keep trying. The crowd was silent, again, and Eleanor could feel the balance tipping, could sense the town deciding, collectively, what kind of place it wanted to be. Finally, Thomas nodded slowly. All right, you can stay, but you keep doing what you've been doing, helping instead of hurting. And the moment that changes, the moment you become that heir again, you're gone. Understood? Jonathan's shoulders sagged with relief. Understood. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people drifting away in small groups, their voices rising in conversation and debate. Some faces were still hard with resentment, others thoughtful, others openly sympathetic. But they were leaving, not driving him out. Eleanor burst through the schoolhouse door and ran down the steps, not caring what anyone thought. She reached Jonathan just as his knees buckled, exhaustion and relief overwhelming him all at once. She caught him, her arms wrapping around him, holding him upright. You did it, she whispered fiercely. You stood your ground. Jonathan's arms came around her, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to sweep him away. They're going to come back, he said quietly. Marcus won't give up. Let him come. We'll face it together. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. You shouldn't have to fight this battle. I'm not fighting for you, Eleanor said. I'm fighting with you. There's a difference. A faint smile touched his lips. When did you get so fierce? About 30 seconds after you walked into my schoolhouse half dead. She cupped his face in her hands. I'm not letting you go, Jonathan. Not to your brother, not to your past, not to anything. Do you understand? He searched her eyes, and whatever he found there made something inside him finally break open. I love you, he said hoarsely. I know I shouldn't. I know it's too soon. I know I don't deserve. Eleanor kissed him, cutting off the words, pouring everything she felt into that kiss. Defiance and hope, and the fierce certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the sun had risen fully over the valley, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. I love you too, Eleanor whispered. Now let's go inside before we give the town even more to talk about. Jonathan laughed, a real laugh, clear and genuine, and together they walked back to the schoolhouse, hand in hand, while the valley watched and whispered and wondered what would happen next. That night, when the wind turned colder, she found her old lesson book on the step. His handwriting across every page, notes he'd written in secret over the past weeks, observations about the children, thoughts about teaching. And on the last page, written in careful script that no longer wavered, I came here trying to forget my name. You taught me to write it again, and in doing so, you taught me that names can mean more than the sins we carry. Thank you for giving me a chance to learn who Jonathan Ransom could be, instead of who he was. Whatever happens next, I won't forget. Eleanor pressed the book to her chest and looked out at the valley stretching dark and endless under the stars, and allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, love and redemption could grow in the same soil where shame had tried to take root. But in the distance, thunder rumbled softly, and she knew the storm wasn't over yet. The drought came slowly, the way all terrible things do, not with drama or warning, but with a quiet persistence that made it impossible to ignore. At first it was just the heat, arriving earlier than usual, settling over the valley like a weight that pressed down on everything. The spring rains that should have come in April never arrived. By May, the grass had begun to yellow at the edges. The creek that ran behind the schoolhouse had dwindled to a trickle, and farmers started speaking in low, worried voices about their crops. By June, the valley was burning under a merciless sun. Eleanor stood at the schoolhouse window, watching dust devils dance across the road where mud puddles used to form after storms. The air tasted dry, gritty, like breathing in powdered earth. Even inside, with all the windows open, the heat was oppressive, making the children listless and irritable during lessons. Behind her, Jonathan set down another bucket of water he'd hauled from the creek, what little remained of it. His shirt was soaked with sweat, clinging to his back, and his face was drawn with exhaustion. He'd been making this trip 4 times a day now, carrying water for drinking and cooking, rationing every drop. It's getting worse, he said quietly, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. The creek's almost dry. Another week, maybe 2, and it'll be gone completely. Eleanor turned from the window. What will we do then? The town well, but everyone else will be using it too. He paused, his expression troubled. People are getting desperate, Eleanor. I can feel it. She knew he was right. She'd seen it in the faces of parents when they dropped their children at school. The tightness around their mouths, the worry in their eyes. Crops were failing. Animals were dying. And as the heat dragged on, as the drought deepened, people started looking for someone to blame. It didn't take long for them to remember that the Ransom Ranch still had water. The ranch sat at the base of the mountains, where underground springs fed a network of wells that had never run dry, even in the worst droughts. The Ransom family had built their empire on that water, had used it as leverage to expand their holdings, to control who prospered and who failed. And now, while the valley suffered, the ranch endured. Eleanor had heard the whispers starting in town, anger simmering just beneath the surface, questions about why the Ransoms weren't sharing their water, why they weren't helping their neighbors in a time of crisis. And underneath those questions, a darker current, blame directed at Jonathan for walking away from the one family that could have made a difference. "They think I should go back," Jonathan said, as if reading her thoughts. He'd moved to stand beside her at the window, his shoulder almost touching hers. "That I should use my influence with my family to help. Do you still have influence with them?" His laugh was bitter. "No. I gave that up the day I left. Marcus made that clear. But they still want you back. They want the heir back, the title, the illusion of continuity. They don't want me. They never did. They want someone who'll do what they're told and not ask questions." He was quiet for a moment. "If I went back now, begging for help, do you know what they demand in return?" Eleanor's chest tightened. "You, completely, forever. They'd make me stay, make me take up the role again, and everything I've tried to build here, everything I've tried to become, it would all disappear." His voice dropped, "And I deserve it, for being weak enough to go crawling back." "You're not weak, Jonathan. Then why do I keep thinking about it?" He turned to face her, and the anguish in his eyes made her heart ache. "Every night I lie awake and think about those children whose parents can't afford to feed them anymore, about Mrs. Chen trying to keep her livestock alive on half rations of water, about Thomas Garrett watching his fields turn to dust. And I think, I could stop this. I could go to my father, beg him to open the wells, to share the water. He might do it if I agreed to come home." Eleanor took his hands in hers. "And then what? You save the valley and lose yourself? Maybe that's the price of redemption." "No." Her voice was fierce. "Redemption isn't about sacrificing who you've become to atone for who you were. That's just trading one prison for another." Jonathan's fingers tightened around hers. "Then what do I do? How do I live with myself, knowing I could help but won't?" Eleanor didn't have an answer. She wanted to tell him it would be all right, that the rains would come, that the valley would survive without the Ransom wells. But she'd lived here long enough to know that wasn't guaranteed. Droughts like this could break a community, could scatter families to the wind, leave towns empty and forgotten. And if that happened, people would remember that Jonathan Ransom had been here and done nothing. The silence between them was heavy with questions neither could answer. Then, from outside, a new sound cut through the afternoon heat, shouting, urgent and alarmed. They both turned to the window and saw a rider coming hard down the road, his horse lathered with sweat, dust billowing behind him. He was waving his hat, calling out something Eleanor couldn't quite make out over the distance. Jonathan was out the door before she could speak, running down the porch steps toward the rider. Eleanor followed, her heart already racing, knowing that nothing good ever came from someone riding that hard in heat like this. The rider pulled up short, his horse dancing sideways, its sides heaving. It was young Billy Morrison, barely 18, his face streaked with dust and fear. "Fire!" he gasped, pointing west. "Fire on the ridge, the whole western side is burning." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She turned to look where Billy was pointing and saw it, a smudge of darkness against the blue sky, growing even as she watched. Not rain clouds, smoke. "How bad?" Jonathan asked, his voice sharp and focused. "Bad. Started in the grassland near the old Burke place, but the wind's pushing it east, toward town." Billy's horse stamped nervously, sensing its rider's fear. "They're trying to cut a fire break, but they need everyone who can swing a shovel or haul water. Sheriff sent me to spread the word." All around them, people were emerging from buildings, shading their eyes against the sun, staring at the growing column of smoke. Eleanor could hear voices rising in alarm, could see the moment fear rippled through the crowd. Fire in a drought was everyone's nightmare. The valley was a tinderbox, the grass dried to straw, every tree and fence post ready to ignite. If the wind shifted wrong, if the flames moved faster than they could contain them, The whole town could burn. Jonathan was already moving, striding toward the schoolhouse. Eleanor, get the children home, now. Then gather every bucket and barrel we have. Where are you going? He paused in the doorway, and the expression on his face was one she'd never seen before. Determined, almost fierce, every hesitation burned away by the immediacy of crisis. To stop it, he said simply. Then he disappeared inside. Eleanor didn't waste time with questions. She rang the schoolhouse bell, 3 sharp, urgent clangs that brought every child running. Within minutes she had them gathered, older students paired with younger ones, instructions given to go straight home and stay there. But Miss Eleanor, one of the little girls said, her eyes wide with fear, what about you? I'll be fine, sweetheart. Go on now. Quickly. She watched them scatter toward their homes, then turned to find Jonathan emerging from the schoolhouse, carrying 2 shovels and a canvas water bag. He'd changed into older clothes, his sleeves already rolled up, his expression set with purpose. You should stay here, he said, reading the protest forming on her face. Absolutely not. Eleanor, we're wasting time arguing. She grabbed one of the shovels from his hand. Let's go. For a moment she thought he might fight her on it. Then he nodded once, sharp and final, and together they ran toward the smoke. The ride to the western ridge felt endless. They'd found horses, borrowed from Thomas Garrett, who'd thrust the reins into Jonathan's hands without a word, and pushed them hard through the heat. Other riders joined them on the road, a steady stream of men and women converging on the fire, all carrying shovels and picks and whatever containers could hold water. As they drew closer, the smoke thickened, turning the air gray and acrid. Eleanor's eyes watered, her throat burning with every breath. The sound reached them before they could see the flames, a roar like wind through a canyon, punctuated by sharp cracks as trees exploded from the heat. Then they crested a low hill and saw it, a wall of fire stretching across the grassland, orange and yellow and terrible in its beauty, devouring everything in its path. The flames stood 10 feet high in places, moving fast across the dried grass, pushed east by the relentless wind. Smoke boiled into the sky, dark and churning, blotting out the sun, and ahead of the flames, a line of people, maybe 50, maybe more, working desperately to cut a fire break, hacking at the ground with shovels and picks, trying to create a strip of bare earth wide enough to stop the fire's advance. Jonathan pulled his horse to a halt and dismounted in one motion. The old Burke place, he said, his voice tight. That's where it started. Eleanor looked at the line of flames and felt her stomach drop. The Burke farm, the land the Ransom family had taken, that had stood empty for 3 years. And now it was burning, and the fire was spreading toward everything the Burke's neighbors had worked their whole lives to build. The symbolism felt cruel and deliberate, as if the valley itself was demanding payment for old sins. They joined the line of workers, Jonathan taking up a shovel without a word, attacking the ground with a fierce intensity that spoke of more than just fighting fire. Eleanor worked beside him, her muscles screaming with every stroke, sweat pouring down her face, mixing with the ash that fell like black snow from the sky. The heat was unbearable. Even 50 yards from the flames, it felt like standing too close to an open furnace, the air so hot it seared her lungs with every breath. Around her, people coughed and gasped, wrapping wet cloths around their faces, but no one stopped working. They couldn't afford to stop. The fire moved closer, the roar growing louder, and Eleanor could feel the fear spreading through the line of workers. The fire break wasn't wide enough yet. The flames would jump it, would keep moving east, and then, "It's not going to hold," someone shouted over the roar. "We need to fall back." "No!" Jonathan's voice cut through the panic. "We widen it here. Another 10 feet. We can do it. We don't have time. Then we make time." He was still digging, his shovel biting into the earth with mechanical precision. "Everyone with water, wet down the break. Everyone else, keep digging. We're not letting it through." There was something in his voice, something commanding, certain, that made people listen, made them trust. Eleanor saw men who'd questioned him weeks ago now following his lead, saw women who whispered about the widow, and the heir now working shoulder to shoulder with them. The line held. They dug with desperate speed, widening the break, while others hauled water from a nearby creek bed, little more than mud now, but enough, and poured it along the line they'd created. The flames drew closer, the heat becoming almost impossible to bear, and Eleanor's vision began to blur from the smoke and exhaustion. Then Jonathan was beside her, pulling her back from the line, Eleanor, you need to rest. I'm fine. You're not. And I need you to be safe. Before she could argue, a shout went up from the northern end of the break. It's jumping! The fire's jumping! Everyone turned to see sparks and embers carried by the wind landing beyond their fire break, catching in the dry grass, starting new flames that spread with terrifying speed. We've lost it, someone said, the words heavy with defeat. We can't stop it now. Eleanor felt the exhaustion and fear threatening to overwhelm her. They'd worked for hours, had given everything, and it wasn't enough. The fire was going to reach the town, was going to destroy homes, businesses, maybe lives. Then she heard the sound of horses. A lot of horses. Everyone turned toward the road and saw them coming, a line of riders, maybe 20 strong, leading wagons laden with barrels and equipment. At the front, sitting straight in his saddle, was Marcus Ransom. The line of exhausted workers fell silent, watching as the Ransom men rode up and dismounted with efficient precision. They moved to the wagons and began unloading. Not just water barrels, but pumps, hoses, equipment that looked like it had been designed specifically for fighting fires on a scale like this. Marcus walked to where Jonathan stood, his expensive clothes coated with dust, his expression unreadable. "You're here," Jonathan said, surprise and suspicion warring in his voice. "Did you think I'd let the valley burn?" Marcus's tone was matter-of-fact. "Whatever else I am, I'm not a fool. If the town goes, the ranch has no one to sell to, no workers to hire, no economy to sustain us." He paused. "Besides, this fire started on land we took. That makes it our responsibility." He turned to address the assembled workers, his voice carrying clearly over the roar of the flames. "My men will handle the pumps and hoses. We have enough water to soak the firebreak and wet down the buildings closest to the fire's path. But we need your help containing the spot fires. Can you do that?" Thomas Garrett stepped forward, his face blackened with soot. "We can do that," Marcus nodded. "Then let's finish this." What followed was chaos organized into something like efficiency. The Ransom men set up their pumps, drawing water from tanks on the wagons and sending powerful streams arcing toward the flames and the firebreak. The townspeople scattered to stamp out the spot fires that kept springing up beyond the line, beating them with wet blankets and shovels. Jonathan worked alongside his brother's men without a word, his exhaustion forgotten in the urgent necessity of the moment. Eleanor saw him everywhere at once, hauling hose, directing efforts, pulling people back when the flames grew too close, and slowly, painfully, they began to turn the tide. The firebreak held, the pumps kept the flames from crossing the line, the spot fires were contained before they could spread. As the afternoon stretched into evening, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the roar of the fire began to diminish. By nightfall, it was over. The grassland on the western side of the ridge was a blackened wasteland, smoking and desolate, but the town was safe. The farms east of the break were untouched. They'd done it. Eleanor sat on the ground, too exhausted to stand, and looked at the scorched earth stretching away into the darkness. Around her, people were collapsing where they stood, some crying with relief, others too tired even for that. Jonathan dropped down beside her, his face streaked with ash and sweat, his clothes burned through in places where embers had landed. He said nothing, just reached out and took her hand, holding it tightly. They sat like that for a long time, watching the last flames flicker and die. Finally, Marcus approached, leading his horse. His men were already packing up the equipment, preparing to leave. He looked down at his brother, his expression inscrutable. "You did well today," Marcus said quietly. Jonathan looked up at him. "Thank you for coming. Don't thank me. Thank the fact that I'm not stupid enough to let my best customers burn." But there was something in his voice, something that might have been grudging respect. "You've changed, little brother. Yes. Is it real? Or are you just playing at being noble?" Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, still holding Eleanor's hand, and faced his brother. "I don't know if it's real. I don't know if redemption is even possible for what I did. But I know I'm trying. And I know I'd rather die trying than go back to who I was." Marcus studied him, and for the first time Eleanor saw something like understanding pass between the two brothers. "Father's dying," Marcus said abruptly. Jonathan's grip on Eleanor's hand tightened. "What? He's been sick for months. The doctors say he has weeks, maybe days." Marcus's jaw tightened. "He's been asking for you." Eleanor felt Jonathan's hand begin to tremble in hers. "I can't," Jonathan said, his voice breaking. "I can't go back there. Not even for that. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm telling you he's dying, and you'll have to live with whatever choice you make." Marcus swung up into his saddle. "But Jonathan, when he's gone, everything changes. The ranch, the family, all of it. You might want to think about what that means for you, for this place, for her." He nodded toward Eleanor, then turned his horse and rode away, his men falling in behind him. Jonathan stood frozen, staring after them, and Eleanor could see the war happening behind his eyes. Duty and guilt and love and fear all tangled together in a knot that had no easy unraveling. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know." The days after the fire were strange, suspended between crisis and recovery. The town began the work of rebuilding, repairing damaged fences, clearing the charred grassland, tending to livestock that had been scattered or injured in the chaos. But underneath the practical work, something had shifted. The fire had forced everyone to work together, had blurred the lines between rancher and farmer, ransom and townsperson, heir and neighbor. And Jonathan had been at the center of it all. People who'd looked at him with suspicion now nodded in greeting when they passed. Mothers who'd hesitated to let their children near him now thanked him for his help during the crisis. He'd proven something in that fire, not that he was forgiven, but that he was committed to being better. But Eleanor could see the toll it was taking. Every night, Jonathan would sit at the table in the schoolhouse, staring at the lesson book she'd given him. But he wasn't seeing the words. His mind was elsewhere. At the ranch, probably, with the father who was dying without him. "You should go," Eleanor said finally, 3 nights after the fire. Jonathan looked up, startled. "What?" "To see your father. Before it's too late." "Eleanor, I'm not saying you should stay. I'm not saying you should forgive him or reconcile or any of that. But you should see him, so you don't spend the rest of your life wondering what you might have said." Jonathan's hands clenched on the table. "What if I can't leave? What if I go there and they won't let me go? Then I'll come get you myself." She reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "I'm not afraid of your family, Jonathan, and you shouldn't be either. Not anymore." He stared at her, something like wonder in his eyes. "How did I ever deserve you? You didn't. You don't. You won't." She smiled softly. "That's not how love works. Love isn't earned, it's given." Jonathan pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and Eleanor held him while he shook with silent sobs. For the father he'd hated and loved, for the boy he'd been, and the man he was trying to become. For everything broken, and everything slowly healing. "I'll go," he whispered finally, "tomorrow. I'll go and say goodbye. I'll be here when you come back. Promise? Promise." They held each other in the lamplight, while outside the prairie stretched dark and endless, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled softly. Not fire this time, but the promise of rain finally coming to heal the scorched earth. When dawn broke through the smoke, the valley was changed, and the drifter stood once more before her, covered in ash and truth. Jonathan left before sunrise. Eleanor woke to find him already dressed, standing at the window in the gray pre-dawn light, staring out at the valley, as if memorizing every detail. He'd changed into his cleanest shirt, had shaved for the first time in weeks, and combed his hair back in a way that made him look older, more formal, more like the heir he'd once been. The transformation frightened her more than she wanted to admit. "You don't have to do this," she said softly from the cot. He turned, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that came from a sleepless night spent wrestling with ghosts. "Yes, I do." Eleanor rose and crossed to him, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. "Then let me come with you." "No." The word was gentle but final. "Jonathan. I need to do this alone, Eleanor. I need to face him without." He paused, searching for words. "Without someone there to catch me if I fall. Do you understand?" She didn't, not really. But she could see the determination in his face, the way he'd already armored himself against whatever waited at the ranch. She simply nodded and helped him gather what little he needed. The notebook he'd carried through the storm, carefully dried and preserved despite the ruined pages. A canteen of water, nothing else. At the door, he paused and turned back to her. "If I'm not back by nightfall, you'll be back. But if I'm not," Eleanor stepped close and pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "You'll be back. Because you promised me. And because you're stronger than whatever's waiting for you out there." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, his eyes closing briefly. Then he opened them, and she saw the steel underneath the fear, the strength he'd been building day by day through every small act of kindness and every moment of choosing to stay instead of run. "I love you," he said quietly. "I know. Now go, before I change my mind and tie you to the stove." He smiled, a real smile, brief but genuine, and then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the porch steps and into the gray morning light. Eleanor stood at the window and watched him disappear into the dawn, riding toward the mountains and the ranch that had shaped him and broken him in equal measure. And she prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, that he would come back whole. The Ransom estate sat at the base of the mountains like a statement of power and permanence. Jonathan had forgotten how imposing it was, the main house rising 3 stories of whitewashed wood and stone, surrounded by outbuildings and barns and corrals that stretched for acres in every direction. Fences lined the property in perfect symmetry, all freshly painted, all maintained to his father's exacting standards. Even in the drought, even with the valley suffering, the ranch looked prosperous, untouchable, fed by the springs that never ran dry. Jonathan stopped his horse at the main gate and felt the old familiar weight settle onto his shoulders, the weight of expectations, of history, of a name that had always felt more like a collar than a birthright. He'd been gone 3 years. But looking at the estate now, it felt like he'd never left. A ranch hand approached from the stable, a young man Jonathan didn't recognize. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm here to see Marcus Ransom." The hand's eyes widened slightly. "And you are?" "Jonathan, his brother." The recognition that flickered across the young man's face was immediate, surprise mixed with something that might have been awe or fear. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir. I'll take your horse." Jonathan dismounted and handed over the reins, then stood for a moment in the courtyard gathering himself. The house loomed before him, its windows like watching eyes, and he could feel the weight of memory pressing down. Every room in that building held ghosts of the boy he'd been, the mistakes he'd made, the person he'd tried so hard to stop being. The front door opened before he could knock. Marcus stood in the doorway, still dressed in his riding clothes from the morning, his expression unreadable. For a long moment the 2 brothers simply looked at each other across the threshold. "You came," Marcus said finally. "You said he was dying. He is." Marcus stepped back, gesturing inside. "He's been asking for you, every day. I wasn't sure you'd come. Neither was I." Jonathan stepped into the house, and immediately the past crashed over him like a wave. Everything was exactly as he remembered. The dark wood paneling, the oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls, the massive chandelier hanging in the entry hall that had been imported from Europe at outrageous expense. Even the smell was the same, leather and pipe tobacco and the faint mustiness of old money preserved under glass. His stomach turned. "He's upstairs," Marcus said, leading the way to the grand staircase. "The doctors have made him as comfortable as possible, but—" He paused on the landing. "It's not pleasant. The illness has been cruel." Jonathan nodded, following his brother up the stairs and down the familiar hallway to their father's bedroom. The door was closed, and from inside he could hear the sound of labored breathing, wet and rattling. Marcus's hand rested on the door handle. "Jonathan, whatever happens in there, whatever he says, remember that dying men sometimes speak truth they were too proud to admit in life, but sometimes they just speak bitterness. I know. Do you?" Marcus's eyes were sharp. "Because the man in there isn't the father we knew. The illness has stripped away the pretense. What's left is complicated." Before Jonathan could respond, Marcus opened the door and stepped aside. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light, and it took Jonathan's eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, he almost didn't recognize the figure in the bed. His father had always been a large man, tall, broad-shouldered, commanding in presence and voice. The kind of man who filled every room he entered, who made decisions with absolute certainty and enforced them with iron will. The man in the bed was skeletal. Illness had hollowed him out, leaving nothing but sharp angles and papery skin stretched over bones. His hair, once thick and dark like Jonathan's, had gone completely white and lay thin against his skull. His breathing was labored, each inhale a visible struggle, and his hands on the coverlet trembled with the effort of simply existing. Jonathan stood frozen in the doorway, shock and old grief warring inside him. The figure in the bed stirred, and clouded eyes opened, struggling to focus. "Marcus." It's not Marcus, father. Jonathan's voice came out rougher than he intended. It's Jonathan. The old man's eyes sharpened suddenly, with a flash of the fierce intelligence that had built an empire. Jonathan. The name was barely a whisper, but it carried weight. You came. You asked for me. I did. A wet cough shook the frail body, and Jonathan instinctively moved forward, his hand reaching out before he could stop himself. But his father waved him away impatiently. Don't. I don't need your pity. I wasn't offering pity. Good. Another labored breath. Sit. Please. While I still have strength to speak. Jonathan pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, his hands clasped between his knees, every muscle tense. Behind him, he heard Marcus leave quietly, closing the door with a soft click. They were alone. His father studied him with those sharp eyes, taking in the changes 3 years had wrought. You look different, thinner, harder. I've been working manual labor? A wheezing sound that might have been a laugh. My heir, the drifter. Marcus told me. Said you'd been teaching children to read, fixing fences, playing at redemption. Jonathan's jaw tightened. It wasn't playing, wasn't it? His father's gaze was penetrating, stripping away pretense the way it always had. Tell me, Jonathan, did it work? Did you find absolution in your charity? No. The honesty seemed to surprise the old man. No, I found purpose. I found peace. I found people who saw me as something other than a name or a tool. But absolution? Jonathan shook his head. That's not something I get to have. Not for what I did. His father was silent for a long moment, his breathing the only sound in the room. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost contemplative. The Burke family. That's what drove you away. It wasn't a question, but Jonathan answered anyway. Yes. I wondered. You drew up dozens of contracts like that one, dispossessed at least 20 families over the years. But that one broke you. Why? Jonathan closed his eyes, remembering. Because I looked James Burke in the eye when he signed that contract. I shook his hand. I told him it was fair that he'd be able to meet the terms. And his wife was standing right there holding their youngest daughter, and she smiled at me. Trusted me. His voice cracked. And I knew that I was lying to them, that in 6 months they'd lose everything. And I did it anyway. Because I told you to. Because I was too much of a coward to say no. The words hung in the air, raw and painful. His father's hand moved slightly on the coverlet, a gesture that might have been reaching toward him, but didn't complete. I made you into that coward. Jonathan's eyes snapped open. What? I made you. The old man's voice was bitter, turned inward. From the time you were old enough to understand, I taught you that loyalty to family meant obedience, that questioning my decisions was betrayal, that the ransom name came before everything, before morality, before compassion, before your own conscience. He paused, struggling for breath. I made you into a tool. And then I was surprised when the tool broke. Jonathan stared at him, unable to speak, unable to process what he was hearing. I'm dying, Jonathan, and dying strips away the lies we tell ourselves. His father's eyes were bright now, with tears or pain or something deeper. I built this empire on the backs of people like the Burkes. I took and took and took, and I told myself it was progress, that it was the way of the world, that the strong survived and the weak fell. And I taught you to believe the same. Father, let me finish. I don't have much time. Another wet cough, more violent this time, and when it passed his lips were flecked with blood. I was wrong. Not about business. I built something that will last generations, but about what it cost, about what I asked you to pay. His hand finally completed its gesture, reaching out to grasp Jonathan's. The grip was weak, trembling but insistent. I'm sorry. The apology hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times over the past 3 years, had rehearsed conversations in his head where his father remained cold and demanding, where Jonathan stood firm in his refusal to return, where words were exchanged like weapons, and both men walked away wounded but unchanged. He'd never imagined this. I don't know what to do with that, Jonathan whispered. You don't have to do anything with it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm just telling you the truth I should have spoken years ago. His father's grip tightened slightly. You were right to leave. You were right to try to become something better than what I made you. Don't let my death pull you back into that life. Marcus said the ranch. The ranch will be fine. Marcus is more capable than anyone gives him credit for. He doesn't want the responsibility, but he'll rise to it once he has no choice. A faint smile crossed the old man's face, and perhaps he'll do better than I did. Perhaps he'll remember that power without compassion is just tyranny dressed in expensive clothes. Jonathan felt tears burning behind his eyes. Why now? Why wait until you're dying to tell me this? Because dying is the only thing that finally made me see clearly. His father's breathing was becoming more labored, each word requiring visible effort. We spend our whole lives building walls, Jonathan. Walls of pride, of certainty, of the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And then death comes, and those walls collapse, and all that's left is truth. He was quiet for a moment, gathering strength. I heard about the fire. About what you did. Jonathan shook his head. I didn't do anything special. I just helped. You led them, Marcus told me. Said you stood your ground when others wanted to retreat. Said you worked shoulder to shoulder with people I'd spent decades trying to control or crush. Said you were. He paused, and something that might have been pride flickered in his eyes. Said you were the man I always claimed I wanted you to be, but never actually taught you how to become. The tears came then, silent and hot, streaming down Jonathan's face. I don't know how to be that man. I'm still figuring it out. Still making mistakes. Good. That means you're trying. That means you're human. His father's hand squeezed his one last time, then fell away, exhausted. Live, Jonathan. Live the life I never gave you permission to have. Love that teacher Marcus says you've been hiding with. Build something that matters, not just something that lasts. And for God's sake, don't waste another moment hating yourself for sins I taught you to commit. Father. But the old man's eyes were closing, his breathing shifting into a rhythm that spoke of sleep, or something deeper. The conversation was over. Whatever else might have been said would remain unspoken. Jonathan sat there for a long time, holding his father's frail hand, watching the rise and fall of his chest, and feeling something inside himself finally begin to break open, not breaking apart, but breaking free. When Marcus opened the door an hour later, Jonathan was still sitting there, tears dried on his face but his expression calm. Is he, Marcus asked quietly, asleep, or unconscious? I'm not sure. Jonathan gently laid his father's hand back on the coverlet and stood. How long does he have? Days, maybe hours. Marcus studied his brother. What did he say to you? That he was sorry, that I should live my own life, that you're more capable than anyone knows. Marcus's eyebrows rose. He said that last part? He did. Huh. Marcus moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside slightly, letting in a shaft of morning light. I suppose dying makes fools of us all, or wise men. I'm not sure there's a difference. Jonathan joined him at the window, and together they looked out over the ranch, the land their father had built, the empire he'd carved from the valley through force of will and ruthless ambition. What will you do with it? Jonathan asked. When he's gone? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Run it differently, I hope. Maybe share the water. Maybe actually pay workers what they're worth. Maybe. He paused. Maybe try not to be the man he was. You'll do better than him, will I? Marcus turned to look at his brother. You got out, Jonathan. You had the courage to walk away. I never did. I just stayed and became a different version of the same thing. It's not too late to change, isn't it? I'm 35. I've spent my entire adult life being the dutiful son, the enforcer, the man who did the things father couldn't dirty his own hands with. Bitterness edged his voice. Do you know how many families I've driven off their land? How many contracts I've enforced that were designed to fail? I was just as guilty as you, Jonathan. I just never felt bad enough about it to run. Jonathan studied his brother, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years, and saw the weight Marcus carried, the guilt and resignation that had hardened into cynicism. Then don't run, Jonathan said quietly. Stay, but change what this place is. Change what the ransom name means. How? Start with the water. Open the wells. Share them with the valley. Show people that power can be used for something other than control. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, but it's necessary. Jonathan moved toward the door, then paused. Marcus, whatever else you've done, you came to fight that fire. You brought resources when you didn't have to. That means something. I told you it was just good business, was it? Because it looked like compassion to me. Marcus had no answer for that. Jonathan left the room and made his way downstairs, through the house that no longer felt like home, and out into the courtyard where his horse waited. The young ranch hand brought it over, and Jonathan mounted quickly, suddenly desperate to be away from this place, to return to the schoolhouse and Eleanor and the life he'd been building. But as he rode toward the gate, Marcus called out from the porch, "Jonathan!" He turned in the saddle. Marcus stood on the steps, silhouetted against the White House, and for a moment he looked exactly like their father had 30 years ago. Proud, commanding, immovable. Then he spoke, and his voice was different, uncertain, human. "Thank you for coming, for whatever you said to him in there." He was calmer after, more at peace. Jonathan nodded. "Take care of him, Marcus, and take care of yourself. Will you come back for the funeral?" The question hung in the air, weighted with implications. Jonathan thought about it, thought about standing in the family cemetery, surrounded by the same people who judged him for leaving, listening to speeches about a man whose legacy was complicated at best and destructive at worst. Then he thought about Eleanor, about the schoolhouse, about the children learning their letters and the neighbors who'd begun to trust him. "No," he said finally. "My place is in the valley now, not here." Marcus nodded slowly as if he'd expected that answer. "Then go. And Jonathan," he paused, "I'm glad you got out. Truly." Jonathan felt his throat tighten, but he simply raised a hand in farewell and turned his horse toward the gate. As he rode away from the ranch, the sun broke fully over the mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. And for the first time in 3 years, Jonathan felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. He didn't know if his father would survive the day. Didn't know what would happen to the ranch, or whether Marcus would truly change the way it operated, or whether the valley would ever fully forgive the ransom name for the harm it had caused. But he knew, with a certainty that felt like bedrock, that he was riding toward home, not away from it. And that made all the difference. Eleanor was standing on the schoolhouse porch when he arrived, her hand shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She'd been watching for him, he realized, had probably spent the entire day watching, worrying, hoping. When she saw him riding up the road, her whole body sagged with relief. Jonathan dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly he could feel her heart beating against his chest. "You came back," she whispered, her face pressed against his shoulder. "I promised. How was it?" Jonathan pulled back just enough to look at her. This woman who'd pulled him from a storm and taught him to write his name again and loved him despite every reason not to. Hard. Painful. Necessary. He touched her face gently. "He apologized, Eleanor. My father actually apologized." Her eyes widened. "What did you say?" "I didn't know what to say. So I just listened, let him speak, and then I left." Jonathan took a shaky breath. "He's dying. Maybe dead already. I don't know. But I'm not going back there. Not for a funeral, not for family obligation, not for anything. My life is here now, with you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure? Because if you need..." "I'm sure." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I'm more sure of this than I've been of anything in my entire life." They stood there on the porch, holding each other as the afternoon light turned golden and the valley stretched peaceful and quiet around them. Then Eleanor pulled back, her expression changing. "Jonathan, there's something I need to show you." She led him inside the schoolhouse, and he saw immediately what she meant. The long table was covered in papers, letters, notes, documents, all addressed to him. "They started arriving this morning," Eleanor explained, "after word spread that you'd gone to the ranch. People wanted you to know." She picked up one of the letters. "They wanted you to know they were grateful, for the fire, for everything you've done." Jonathan moved to the table and picked up a letter at random. It was from Mrs. Chen, written in careful, shaky script. "Mr. Ransom, you fixed my fence when I couldn't afford to. You brought food when my animals were starving. You never asked for thanks, but I give it anyway. My family lost our water rights to your father. I hated the Ransom name for 20 years. But you are teaching me that names can change their meaning. Thank you." He set it down with trembling hands and picked up another, then another. Letters from farmers whose fences he'd repaired, from mothers whose children he'd helped teach, from men who'd fought the fire beside him and seen firsthand what kind of person he'd become. "There must be 50 of them," Eleanor said softly. "Maybe more." Jonathan couldn't speak. The weight of forgiveness, not complete, not uncomplicated, but real, pressed against his chest until he thought he might break from the force of it. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. The valley remembers Jonathan, but it's learning to remember differently. He turned to her, this woman who'd saved him in more ways than one, and found words he'd been trying to articulate since the day he walked into her schoolhouse half dead from the storm. "Marry me." Eleanor's breath caught. "What? Marry me? Not because it's practical, or because the town expects it, or because we need to make our situation respectable. Marry me because I love you, because you make me want to be better every single day, because when I think about the future, all I see is you." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "Jonathan, I know I'm not much. I have no money, no prospects, no future beyond teaching children and fixing fences. I know people will talk, that some will never forgive what I did, that this life will be hard. But I'm asking anyway. Will you marry me?" Eleanor laughed through her tears, the sound bright and clear. "You're an idiot." He blinked. "What? You think I care about money or prospects? You think I need some grand future?" She cupped his face in her hands. "I fell in love with a man who showed up in a storm clutching a ruined notebook, who spent weeks learning to write his name again just so he could remember what it felt like to create something good, who stood in front of his brother and the entire town and chose truth over comfort. That's the man I want. That's the future I want. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes, you beautiful fool." Jonathan kissed her then, deep and desperate and joyful, and for the first time in his life he felt truly free. Free from the past, from guilt, from the weight of a name that had defined him for too long. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jonathan looked around the schoolhouse, at the benches where children learned, at the table where they'd spent so many evenings together, at the letters scattered across the surface bearing witness to a community learning to forgive. "Now," he smiled, "now we build a life. Together." Outside, the sun was setting over the valley, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose and purple. The scorched grassland from the fire was already showing signs of new growth, tiny green shoots pushing up through the ash. And in the distance, so faint they almost missed it, came the sound of thunder, not fire this time, but rain, finally breaking the drought, finally bringing relief to the parched earth. The valley was healing, and so were they. When spring came, the valley bloomed again, carrying whispers of a school rebuilt on soil healed by truth. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came with a fury of color and life that made the long drought and the fire-scorched winter feel like a distant nightmare. Eleanor woke one morning in early April to find the world transformed. Where there had been ash and blackened earth, green shoots now pushed through with relentless determination. Wildflowers bloomed across the meadows, Indian paintbrush and lupine and columbine turning the valley into a patchwork of purple and red and gold. The creek behind the schoolhouse, which had dwindled to nothing during the drought, now ran clear and strong, its banks lined with new grass that swayed in the warm breeze. The valley had healed itself, and so had they. Eleanor stood at the window, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of rose and amber, and felt a contentment settle into her bones that she'd never thought possible. Behind her, she could hear Jonathan moving quietly through the schoolhouse, starting the fire in the stove, setting up the classroom for the day. They'd been married in November, 2 weeks after his father's death. It had been a small ceremony, held in the schoolhouse with only a handful of witnesses, Thomas Garrett and his family, Mrs. Chen, a few of the other townspeople who'd come to trust Jonathan over the months. No grand celebration, no elaborate dress, just simple vows spoken in the lamplight, promises to stand together through whatever came next. Eleanor had worn her best dress, the one she'd been married in before, and for a moment she'd worried that it might feel like a betrayal of her first husband's memory. But as she'd stood before Jonathan, his hands trembling slightly as he held hers, she'd realized that love wasn't a finite resource. That honoring what she'd had didn't mean she couldn't embrace what she had now. Her first marriage had been built on youthful hope and quiet companionship. This one was built on something harder won, on forgiveness and second chances, and the knowledge that both of them had been broken and were choosing to heal together. The ceremony had lasted 10 minutes. The celebration afterward, coffee and cake shared around the schoolhouse table, had lasted until midnight, filled with laughter and stories and a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. It had been perfect. Now, 5 months later, Eleanor turned from the window to find her husband watching her, a soft smile on his face. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep. Too much to do today. The dedication? The dedication." Jonathan moved to stand beside her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Together they looked out at the meadow beyond the schoolhouse, at the freshly turned earth and the framework of timber that had risen over the past 3 months. The new school. It had been Marcus's idea, surprisingly. He'd arrived at the schoolhouse in January, just after the new year, riding alone through snow that came up to his horse's knees. Eleanor had answered the door to find him standing on the porch, hat in hand, looking uncertain in a way she'd never seen before. "Is Jonathan here?" he'd asked. "He's out back, splitting wood." Marcus had nodded, then hesitated. "Mrs. Ransom, may I call you Eleanor? You may—" "Eleanor, I need to speak with both of you. About the future." She'd led him inside and called for Jonathan, and the three of them had sat around the schoolhouse table while Marcus explained what he wanted to do. Their father had died the day after Jonathan's visit, peacefully in his sleep. The will had been read, the estate settled, and Marcus had inherited everything, the ranch, the land, the wells, all of it. And with that inheritance had come a choice. "I can keep running things the way Father did," Marcus had said, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee Eleanor had poured. "Take what I can, push out anyone who gets in my way, build the empire bigger and bigger until there's nothing left, but ransom land from the mountains to the rail line." He'd paused, staring into the coffee as if it held answers. "Or I can try to do what Jonathan suggested, change what the ransom name means." Jonathan had leaned forward. "What are you saying, Marcus?" "I'm saying I want to open the wells, share the water with anyone who needs it, free of charge. I'm saying I want to pay workers fair wages, not just what I can get away with. I'm saying—" He'd looked up, meeting his brother's eyes. "I'm saying I want to give back some of what we took." The silence that followed had been heavy with possibility. "I don't know how to do that," Marcus had continued. "I don't know how to undo decades of my father's work, how to make amends to people we've hurt, but I thought—" He'd turned to Eleanor. "I thought we could start with the school." Eleanor had frowned. "What about the school?" "It's too small. 1 room, 1 teacher, barely enough space for 30 children, and the valley's growing. More families settling, more children needing education." Marcus had pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I'm offering to fund a new school, bigger building, more teachers, proper equipment, and I want you to run it, Eleanor, both of you. You as head teacher, Jonathan as administrator." Eleanor had been too stunned to speak. Jonathan had found his voice first. "Why?" "Because education is how you change things, how you give people tools to build their own futures instead of being dependent on whoever owns the most land." Marcus had smiled faintly, and because Father would have hated it, which makes it exactly the right thing to do. They'd talked for hours that night, working out details, asking questions, testing whether Marcus was serious or if this was some elaborate manipulation. But as the night wore on, Eleanor had seen something in Jonathan's brother that she'd never noticed before. A genuine desire to be better, to break the pattern that had shaped him, to use the power he'd inherited for something other than control. By the time Marcus left in the gray dawn light, they'd agreed. The new school would be built in the meadow behind the old schoolhouse, on land Marcus donated from the ranch holdings. It would have 3 classrooms, space for over 100 students, and a small apartment where Jonathan and Eleanor could live. Marcus would fund the construction and provide an endowment for teacher salaries and supplies. In return, all he asked was that they name it the Burke Valley School, after the family that had been driven away. "So their name lives on," he'd said quietly. "So people remember what we took and what we're trying to give back," Jonathan had agreed, with tears in his eyes. Now, 4 months later, the school was nearly complete. The framework stood strong and straight, the walls finished, the roof installed. The windows, real glass, not oiled paper, caught the morning light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Inside, the rooms were freshly painted, the floors sanded smooth, and the desks built by local craftsmen were arranged in neat rows waiting for students. It was beautiful, and today was the dedication ceremony. The valley gathered at midday, when the sun stood high and warm overhead and the meadow was alive with birdsong and the rustle of new grass in the breeze. They came from all over, farmers and ranchers, shopkeepers and laborers, families who'd lived in the valley for generations and newcomers who'd arrived within the past year. They came with children and grandparents, with baskets of food for the celebration afterward, with curiosity and hope and the tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, things were changing for the better. Eleanor stood at the front of the crowd, her hand clasped in Jonathan's, and watched them arrive. She recognized so many faces now. Parents of students she'd taught, neighbors who'd helped fight the fire, people who'd written letters of gratitude during the darkest part of winter. Mrs. Chen was there, leaning on her cane, a smile creasing her weathered face. Thomas Garrett stood with his family, his oldest son, the one who'd mocked Jonathan that first day, now helping set up chairs for the elderly. Even some of the families, who'd been displaced years ago, had returned, drawn back by word that the valley was under new management, that the ransom name no longer meant what it once had. And at the back of the crowd, sitting astride his black horse, was Marcus. He told them he wouldn't come, that his presence would only complicate things, remind people of old grievances. But there he was, watching from a distance, his expression unreadable but his attendance speaking volumes. Jonathan squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Are you ready?" She took a deep breath. "I think so." "Are you?" "No. But let's do it anyway." They stepped forward together, and the crowd quieted, all eyes turning to them. Eleanor had prepared a speech, had written and rewritten it dozens of times over the past weeks. But now, standing here with the new school at her back and the whole valley watching, the words felt inadequate. So she set aside what she'd planned and spoke from the heart. 3 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, I was alone in a one-room schoolhouse teaching other people's children and wondering if anything I did mattered. I'd lost my husband, lost my place in the world, and I'd settled into a life that was small, safe, lonely. She paused, feeling Jonathan's presence beside her like an anchor. Then one night, a storm came, and a stranger knocked on my door, half dead and clutching a notebook, like it was the only thing in the world worth saving. And I had a choice, let him in, or send him back into the rain. Around the meadow, people nodded. They knew this story. It had become legend in the valley, the widow and the heir, the storm and the redemption. I let him in, and that choice changed everything, not just for me, but for this valley, because that stranger... She turned to look at Jonathan, who was fighting to keep his composure. That stranger was carrying more than just a ruined notebook. He was carrying guilt and shame and the weight of mistakes he didn't know how to fix. And he'd spent 3 years running from a name that felt like a prison. Eleanor turned back to the crowd. But here's what I learned. Names don't have to be prisons. They can be promises. They can be second chances. They can mean something completely different than what they meant before. If we're brave enough to change them. She gestured to the building behind her. This school stands on land that was taken from a family named Burke. It's funded by money from a family named Ransom. And it will be run by a woman who used to be a Marsh and is now a Ransom herself. 3 names, 3 stories, all tangled together in complicated ways. Her voice strengthened. But today, we're giving those names new meaning. The Burkes will be remembered, not just as victims, but as the namesake of a school that will educate generations of children. The Ransoms will be known not just for what they took, but for what they chose to give back. And she smiled, feeling tears prick her eyes. I get to be part of building something that matters. The crowd was silent, listening with an attention that felt sacred. This school is for every child in this valley, Eleanor continued. Rich or poor, new settler or old family, it doesn't matter. Knowledge doesn't care about your last name, or your father's mistakes, or how much land you own. It just cares that you're willing to learn. She looked at Jonathan, who nodded encouragingly. My husband wanted to speak today, but he asked me to say something on his behalf. He asked me to tell you that he knows he can't undo the past. He knows that some of you have every reason to hate the Ransom name, to refuse what's being offered today, to hold on to your anger and hurt. Eleanor's voice dropped, intimate now, as if she were speaking to each person individually. But he also wants you to know that he's spent every day since he came back to this valley trying to earn your trust. Not because he deserves forgiveness, he'll tell you himself that he doesn't, but because he believes this community deserves better than the legacy his family built. And he hopes that maybe someday his children will grow up in a valley where the Ransom name means something good. She felt Jonathan's hand tighten around hers, and she knew he was thinking the same thing she was. about the child growing inside her. Too early to show, but real nonetheless, the future they were building together. So today, Eleanor said, her voice rising, we dedicate this school not just to education, but to the idea that people can change, that communities can heal, that names can be rewritten, and futures can be rebuilt, and grace can grow even in soil that's been scorched by fire. She turned and placed her hand on the school's wall, feeling the warmth of the sun-heated wood against her palm. I dedicate the Burke Valley School. May it stand for 100 years. May it teach generations of children to read and write and think and dream. May it be a place where mistakes are learned from, not repeated. And may it always, always remember that every person, no matter their name, no matter their past, deserves a chance to become something better. The silence that followed was profound. Then, from the back of the crowd, Marcus Ransom began to clap. It started slowly, just his hands coming together in steady rhythm. But then others joined, first Mrs. Chen, then Thomas Garrett, then more and more until the entire meadow was filled with applause that rolled like thunder across the valley. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, and beside her, Jonathan had given up trying to maintain composure and was openly weeping, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions too long held back. The crowd surged forward, people calling out congratulations, children running toward the school to be the first to see inside, parents shaking Jonathan's hand and hugging Eleanor, and talking excitedly about enrollment and curriculum and the future. In the chaos, Eleanor found herself face to face with Marcus. He dismounted and made his way through the crowd, and now stood before her, hat in hand, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. He paused, searching for words. That was extraordinary. Thank you for making it possible, Eleanor said sincerely. I just provided money, you two provided the vision. He glanced over at Jonathan, who was surrounded by well-wishers but watching his brother with cautious hope. May I speak with him? Of course. Eleanor stepped aside, and Marcus moved to his brother's side. She watched as Jonathan turned, saw his brother, and for a moment the crowd seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them. Marcus extended his hand. Jonathan stared at it for a long moment, and Eleanor could see the war happening behind his eyes, all the old hurt and resentment battling against the possibility of forgiveness. Then Jonathan gripped his brother's hand and pulled him into an embrace. The crowd erupted in fresh applause, and Eleanor felt her heart swell almost past bearing as she watched the two brothers hold each other. Years of complicated history contained in that simple gesture. When they finally separated, both men were wiping their eyes, trying to maintain dignity and failing spectacularly. Marcus cleared his throat. I should go. This is your day, not mine. Stay, Jonathan said. Please, you're part of this too. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. All right, but only if you stop making me cry in public. It's terrible for my reputation. Jonathan laughed, a clear, genuine sound, and together the brothers turned to face the school, standing side by side as the valley celebrated around them. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of joy and community. Children raced through the empty classrooms, their voices echoing off the walls, claiming desks and windows and corners that would become theirs when school started in the fall. Parents toured the building, marveling at the space and the quality of construction, already planning what supplies their children would need. Outside, tables had been set up laden with food, more food than Eleanor had ever seen gathered in one place. Roasted meats and fresh bread, preserves and pies, early vegetables from gardens that had survived the drought. People shared what they had freely, and for a few hours the meadow became a place where old grudges were set aside, and new friendships were forged. Eleanor moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions, but part of her attention was always on Jonathan. She watched him laugh with Thomas Garrett, help Mrs. Chen to a chair, lift a small child onto his shoulders so she could see through a classroom window. This was who he'd always been underneath, she realized. Not the cold air his father had tried to create, but this, warm, patient, genuinely kind. The storm and the fire and the long months of rebuilding had just stripped away the layers that had hidden it. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the crowd gradually dispersed. Families packed up their baskets, children were collected from their explorations, and wagons began the journey back to farms and homes scattered across the valley. Eleanor and Jonathan stood on the porch of the new school, waving goodbye, until finally they were alone in the golden evening light. Jonathan wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her close. We did it. You did it. This was your idea. No, Marcus's idea. I just agreed to help. Well then, we all did it. Eleanor leaned back against him, exhausted and happy. Together, they stood like that for a long moment, watching the sun paint the valley in colors that seemed almost unreal in their beauty. Then Jonathan spoke quietly, his voice full of wonder. Do you remember what you said that first night, when I asked you why you let me in? Eleanor thought back to that moment, the storm raging, the stranger on her floor, her own fear and confusion. I'm not sure I remember exactly. You said everyone deserves a place, even people who've made mistakes. His arms tightened around her. You gave me that place, Eleanor. You gave me everything. She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his face. No, you earned it. Every single day, with every choice you made to stay and help and try to be better. I just loved you while you did it. Just? He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd finally learned to be at peace with himself. That wasn't just anything. That was everything. Eleanor kissed him softly, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized she'd cried. What do we do now? Jonathan looked past her at the school, at the meadow beyond where wildflowers swayed in the breeze, at the valley stretching away toward mountains that glowed purple in the fading light. Now, he said, now we live, we teach, we build a life here, we raise our child. He placed his hand gently over her stomach, over the secret they'd been keeping. We raise our children to be better than we were, and we remember, every single day, how lucky we are to have been given a second chance. Children. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. I haven't even had the first one yet. I'm an optimist. She laughed, the sound bright and clear in the evening air. Since when? Since I married a woman who taught me that redemption is possible, that names can change their meaning, that love is stronger than shame. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Since I learned that sometimes the storm brings exactly what you need, even if you don't know you need it. Eleanor felt fresh tears spring to her eyes, happy tears this time filled with gratitude and hope, and the bone-deep certainty that despite everything they'd been through, despite all the pain and mistakes and hard-won forgiveness, they had found something rare and precious. They had found home. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, they walked hand in hand back to the old schoolhouse, the place where Jonathan had first written his name again, where Eleanor had first realized she could love someone new without betraying her past, where they'd built the foundation of this life they were living. Tomorrow, there would be work to do. Final preparations for the school year, supplies to order, teachers to interview, a community to serve. Tomorrow, there would be challenges and complications and the ongoing work of building something better from the ruins of what had been. But tonight, there was just this. Two people who'd been broken in different ways, learning to be whole together, surrounded by a valley that had also been scarred and was learning to heal. Inside the old schoolhouse, Jonathan lit the lamp while Eleanor made tea. They sat at the table where they'd spent so many evenings, where he'd learned to write and she'd learned to hope again, and they talked quietly about the future, about the child coming, about names, whether to use family names or choose something entirely new, about the school and the students they would teach, about Marcus and whether he would truly change the ranch, or whether the weight of history would pull him back into old patterns, about small things and large things and everything in between. And on the last page of Jonathan's notebook, the one he'd carried through the storm, that Eleanor had carefully preserved and dried and bound with new covers, he wrote, Year 3, Day 187. Today we dedicated the Burke Valley School. E gave a speech that made me cry in front of the whole valley, which she thought was hilarious. Marcus came. We embraced. I hope, we might become brothers again, not just men who share blood. The valley forgives slowly, and perhaps some will never forgive at all. I can live with that. What I can't live with is not trying. E told me tonight that she's carrying our child. A girl, she thinks, though it's too early to know. We talked about names. She wants to name her Grace, after her grandmother. I want to name her Hope, after what E gave me when I had none left. We'll probably compromise and call her something like Margaret because that's how marriage works. But whatever we call her, she'll grow up in a valley learning to heal. She'll go to a school named for a family her grandfather destroyed, funded by the inheritance I walked away from, taught by parents who learned that redemption isn't a destination. It's a daily practice. I came here 3 years ago trying to forget my name. E taught me to write it again. But more than that, she taught me that names are just sounds until we fill them with meaning. That Jonathan ransom can mean something different than it meant before. That's the gift she gave me, not forgiveness. I'm still working on believing I deserve that. But possibility, the chance to write a different story. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'll face it with her beside me. And that's enough. More than enough. It's everything. He set down the pen and closed the notebook carefully. Eleanor looked up from her tea. What did you write? That I love you, and that we're going to be okay. Just okay. He smiled. Better than okay. Happy. Hopeful. Home. Home, Eleanor repeated softly, testing the word. Yes, that's exactly what this is. They finished their tea in comfortable silence, then prepared for bed. As they lay together in the darkness, the window opened to let in the cool spring air. They could hear the sounds of the valley settling into sleep. The distant call of a night bird, the whisper of wind through new grass, the gentle murmur of the creek running full and clear, and somewhere in that darkness, in the meadow where the new school stood waiting, wildflowers bloomed under starlight, their petals opening to the night, patient and persistent, and utterly unaware that they were growing in soil that had been scorched and broken and healed. Just like the people who would fill that school in the months and years to come. Just like the man who'd arrived in a storm and the woman who'd pulled him inside. Just like the valley itself. Learning that endings and beginnings are often the same moment, seen from different angles. The sun would rise tomorrow over Burke Valley School. Children would come, eager and curious. Teachers would teach. Parents would volunteer. The community would gather and grow and become something it had never been before. A place where second chances were possible, where names could be rewritten, where grace could take root even in the hardest soil. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of the old schoolhouse, Jonathan and Eleanor simply held each other and slept peacefully. Two souls who'd wandered through fire and storm to find their way home. And the valley, wise in the way that land becomes wise when it's witnessed generations of human struggle and triumph, simply continued its ancient work, growing, healing, making new things from the ashes of the old. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tomorrow would also bring hope. And in the end, that was enough. The sun sets over the valley warm and golden, as if the land itself had learned to forgive.